Давайте, резче, тут 3 единицы горит, ебать.
On the highway leading to Crimea, a convoy of fuel tankers is ablaze. The Russian driver behind the wheel is shouting in panic.
Давай.
Come on, drive. Damn it, I can't see a thing. Damn it.
This is the current state of the land supply route to Crimea, a route Ukrainian soldiers have named the Highway of Death. And this is the image not of a single road, but of the lifeline of an entire occupation being severed. Russia's occupation administration reported to the Kremlin that the road to Crimea was fully under control. But that report didn't last even 24 hours, since in reality, Crimea is being besieged on 3 fronts at once, from the land, from the sea, and along its energy lines. The peninsula is sinking into darkness, supply convoys are burning, and this piece of land that Putin considers his crown jewel is slowly being turned into an island, a besieged, isolated, unsustainable island. Before we get into how these 3 arms of the siege work and why they're dragging Crimea toward a point of no return, we have one request. Independent geopolitics analysis like this gets suppressed by the algorithm. Subscribing, liking, and leaving a comment directly helps this video reach the people who'd want to see it. Now let's begin. The first arm of the siege ties down to the only major land route connecting Crimea to Russia, the R280 highway. This corridor, which Russia calls Novorossiya, is a logistics line of about 500 kilometers, stretching from Rostov through Mariupol, Berdyansk, and Melitopol to Crimea. Since the start of the war, Russia has moved fuel, ammunition, and military equipment to the occupied southern regions and to Crimea along this road. But as the Kerch Bridge grew increasingly non-functional, this land corridor turned into a lifeline for Russia that was vital and just as fragile. And Ukraine focused precisely on cutting this rope. As part of a strategy called the Middle Strike campaign, Ukrainian drones began systematically destroying the fuel tankers, ammunition trucks, and convoys along this route. The result was so devastating that, according to commanders, Russian military traffic along this road fell by up to 71%. The name Ukrainian soldiers gave this route sums up the destruction: the Highway of Death. The genius of this strategy is in the logic of its targeting. Ukraine targets not the existing stockpiles in Russia's depots, but the capacity that carries those stockpiles. A Russian brigade needs hundreds of tons of fuel, ammunition, and supplies a day to hold on at the front, and this material has to flow continuously. So Ukraine cuts that flow itself. By striking the tanker, the truck, the bridge, it makes it impossible for supplies to reach the front. Rather than destroying the shell in the depot, it cuts the shell's road to the front. This creates a far larger effect with far fewer resources. The backbone of this campaign is a Ukrainian unmanned systems brigade that has earned a reputation for its long-range drones. According to this unit, in July alone, about 500 vehicles and nearly 400 motorcycles were destroyed along the corridor. When the main roads were struck, Russia tried to bypass them using field and dirt roads. But that didn't work either, since the drones could detect and strike vehicles on any terrain. In short, Russia finding a safe route along this corridor is now nearly impossible. The concrete results of this pressure are clearly visible on the ground too. Bridges were struck one by one, convoys were forced to divert off the main roads, and burned-out vehicle hulks piled up along the route. Independent analysis organizations confirm this effect as well. According to the US-based Institute for the Study of War, Ukraine's middle-range strikes have significantly degraded Russia's ability to use this key road to Crimea. But Ukraine's target wasn't only the highway. Every leg of the corridor was systematically brought down. The rail bridge over the North Crimean Canal was destroyed in June. The Chonhar Bridge connecting Crimea to the mainland was struck twice and crippled. So Russia's 3 land transport options, the main highway, secondary roads, and rail, were knocked out one by one. This corridor, where hundreds of vehicles once flowed each day, has now turned into a line of fire where every crossing is a gamble. This land siege has a chain effect too. Crimea serves as a supply hub not just for itself, but for all the southern regions Russia occupies, for example, the Kherson front. As the land corridor closes, Russia's ability to supply these regions the long way around, through Crimea, also weakens. This is why analysts say Ukraine's strategy, in fact, targets the entire southern front line. And this was only the first step of a much larger goal for Ukraine. In the defense minister's words, to turn the peninsula into an island. Russian lines have collapsed. Ukraine's Skala Special Assault Regiment, in a massive breakthrough on the Dnipropetrovsk front, cleared 75 square kilometers of the grey zone and pushed Russia's line of control deep back. And what made this collapse possible was neither a tank corps nor an artillery barrage, only a 3-day, relentless drone campaign. Recorded as one of the summer's most critical offensives, this operation is rewriting the rules of modern warfare before our eyes. But the real story isn't the territory taken. What Skala did was strike the enemy at its logistics before its land, cut the supply lines, and let an entire army collapse under its own weight. To understand how this approach turned Russia's southern front into a nightmare, how it threatens the vital corridor to Crimea, and why it condemned Moscow to a defense trapped in its own web, we first have to look inside those 3 days. Before we unpack how this model works and how it's changing the character of the war, a small request. Independent war and geostrategy analysis like this has lately been suppressed by the algorithm, and the video isn't reaching many of the people who would want to see it. Subscribing, liking the video, and leaving even a single word in the comments directly helps us break through that suppression. Now, back to the front. Let's start with how it began. This breakthrough is really the fruit of a seed planted months earlier. Earlier this year, Ukraine had already advanced 400 square kilometers in the same area, breaking Russian lines. After that break, the Russian High Command panicked and put its heaviest cards on the table to plug the gap. It hastily massed over 30,000 troops in the area, including the 120th Marine Infantry Brigade and the full 90th Tank Division. Against this overwhelming buildup, Ukraine's advance had to halt. Charging such a force head-on would have been a disaster. And it was exactly here that Skala chose a very different recipe instead of a classic infantry assault. Take the enemy out of the equation first. It launched an intense 3-day drone campaign, and the target list was no accident. The campaign advanced by stacking one layer on top of another. First in line was Russian firepower. North Korean-made Koksan self-propelled guns were targeted, stripping away the fire support behind the arriving Russian troops. Then came mobility. Armored personnel carriers were struck, paralyzing the unit's maneuver. Then manpower. Russian reinforcements were hit on the road before they even reached the front. And finally, logistics. Strikes on military trucks severed the supply and support lines. By the end of 3 days, in a single sector, 107 pieces of equipment had been neutralized, and a substantial part of Russia's firepower, transport, and logistics had evaporated. And this wasn't a one-sided advantage either. Ukraine simultaneously fortified its own rear. It installed 42 kilometers of anti-drone netting along the roads, letting ammunition, reinforcements, and assault groups move without becoming prey to Russian FPV drones. So one side kept its supply flowing freely, while the other's veins were being cut. Once the ground was prepared, the assault came. Dozens of assault groups launched a simultaneous offensive from the Veliko-Mikhailivka area with round-the-clock drone support. Skala first cleared Ternov, then turned south to secure the right flank towards Zaporizhzhia. To the north, it widened the bridgehead and captured Sika, using it as a springboard to leap east toward Malivka. Reconnaissance drones marked Russian positions, artillery suppressed them, and FPV drones found those who tried to flee. In the end, Ukraine pushed up to 10 kilometers into Russian-held territory and retook that 75 square kilometers, while the 120th Marine Infantry Brigade, sent in as reinforcement, was rendered combat ineffective and forced to withdraw. The strategic meaning of this outcome is far larger than the area on the map. The sole purpose of Russia hastily massing the 120th Marine Infantry Brigade and the 99th Tank Division was to plug the breach and stop Ukraine's advance. When that brigade was rendered combat ineffective and pulled back, Moscow's stabilization effort itself collapsed. Skala's breakthrough no longer has to stop. The regiment is in a position to strike Russia's next supply line, and just as it did to the 120th, it can keep eroding both frontline and rear elements at once. So while Moscow tries to build a new defensive line from scratch with exhausted forces, Ukraine holds a proven model for sustaining both the initiative and the advance. An army's most expensive reinforcements being neutralized by a handful of cheap drones before they even reach the front sums up the new math of this war in a single frame. And this approach has a name: soften the enemy before the assault. That is, win the battle long before the real infantry contact begins. And this regiment doesn't leave its own soldiers behind either. Under enemy fire, it carried out a rescue operation to evacuate wounded assault troops along 15 kilometers, delivering water to the encircled point by drone. Kyiv is paying a heavy price to keep the initiative, but it's paying it.
Lack of electricity, together with the lack of water, the lack of propane gas for the stove.
No gasoline, no fuel, no electricity. You can hear generators running.
For many years, Crimea was the most precious jewel in Putin's crown. But today, it looks badly exposed. The peninsula is in the grip of a major fuel crisis.
I'm standing on Sunday to fill up the equipment with canisters. So, we made it. Now we are burning the stocks of the Crimean bandits. For the first time in my bags, I carry so much cash.
Sergei Aksyonov, the governor of the occupation administration, announced that they cannot guarantee daily sales at the gas stations.
The fuel crisis continues. Please be patient. There won't be large supplies of fuel available anytime soon.
But this is only the tip of the iceberg. Beyond fuel, people on the peninsula now struggle to reach even their most basic needs. There is no electricity for most of the day, and when the power goes, the water pumps stop too, so nothing comes out of the taps. And most importantly, even getting food has become a luxury. Store shelves are emptying, and the basic goods that remain are sold under per-person quotas.
So rice, buckwheat, 3 pieces each. Well, everything. 3 pieces each, except flour.
Add to this a collapsed mobile network, shuttered shops, and disrupted public transport. None of this is the result of a natural disaster.
Complete transport collapse. All the cars are just standing there with different license plates. No gasoline, no fuel, no electricity. You can hear generators running. Generators are working because there is no other way to get power. Stores aren't operating, banks aren't operating, nothing works at all. There is no water either, the reason is unclear. On top of that, there is the heat. There are almost no people.
It all comes down to a single cause. For months, Ukraine has been cutting every road to the peninsula one by one. The bridge, the highway, the railway, the sea route. And as this isolation deepens, the tension in Crimea rises with it. The occupation administration's social media accounts are now overflowing with complaints and calls for help. The comparison residents have found to describe what they're living through tells the whole story on its own.
Today is already the second week since they have been sitting without electricity and water.
Marina, who runs a guest house in Yevpatoria, put it this way: "For 12 years we were told Crimea was 100% protected. Then, in literally 1 month, we went back to the Stone Age. No electricity, no water, no fuel." And to escape this picture, the 2.5 million civilians living on the peninsula and the tens of thousands of military personnel attached to the Black Sea Fleet now have a single thought in mind: leaving Crimea. And this is not a guess. At times, exit queues stretching for kilometers form on the Kerch Bridge, and people try to take refuge in Siberia, 3,000 kilometers away. Now I'll walk you through how this collapse happened, step by step. And the starting point is clear. The tightest link in this chain of isolation is fuel. But before we open this chain step by step, one small favor. Independent war and geopolitics analysis like this has lately been suppressed by the algorithm, and the video doesn't reach many of the people who'd want it. Subscribing, liking, and leaving even a single word in the comments directly helps us break through that. Now let's start with that first link: fuel. Without knowing how fuel reaches Crimea, it's impossible to understand this crisis. Because the peninsula has no refinery of its own, every drop of gasoline and diesel it needs is carried in from outside. One of the main routes for that transport was the R-280 Novorossiya highway. Ukraine's armed forces, using unmanned aerial vehicles, established de facto fire control over this highway. As a result, gas stations on the peninsula began halting sales of gasoline and diesel. Aksionov banned cash sales of AI-92 and AI-95 gasoline. Fuel would now be dispensed only with vouchers purchased in advance, with a 20-litre limit per vehicle. 20 litres isn't even half the tank of an average car. What's more, the administration resorted to an unusual method to keep this quota from being breached. It assigned officials from municipal and administrative bodies to every gas station on the peninsula, in the capacity of inspectors. The natural consequence didn't take long. Local chat groups and social media networks quickly turned into a black market. In Sevastopol, the restrictions tightened almost weekly. First, sales were tied to cash. Then came prepaid fuel cards and vouchers. Later, residents could buy a maximum of 20 litres a week using QR codes distributed through the state-backed messaging app called Max. But those QR codes didn't solve it either, because the batch arriving at a station was often gone in under an hour. On June 26th, a state of emergency was declared across the peninsula. The stated reason was directly the fuel and food shortage. How this scarcity fed into prices speaks far more clearly than official statements. At times, fuel on the peninsula reached $5 a litre. But here's the truly striking part. Past a certain point, even money stopped being a solution. Alexander Liev, who served as tourism minister in Crimea's autonomous administration before 2014, described the situation on July 10th like this. There used to be some fuel sold under the counter, and sometimes something would turn up at the stations, even at exorbitant prices. But now there's no fuel anywhere, not even at exorbitant prices. The most concrete indicator of where people have ended up, though, is hidden in search engines. On the peninsula, searches for "how to make gasoline at home" exploded. The first concrete consequence of the fuel crisis showed up on store shelves. Residents of Simferopol and Sevastopol began complaining in local chat groups that basic foodstuffs were unavailable. And the list of vanished products was the same everywhere. Sugar, buckwheat, rice, pasta, flour, salt, and sunflower oil. And people chose to stockpile rather than wait and see. In the large chain stores, sugar and cheap legume varieties sold out quickly. The stores then took their own measures, and restriction signs went up on the shelves. So why can't a giant country like Russia feed a peninsula under its own control? According to an analysis by Ukraine's Center for Countering Disinformation, this has two components. The first is demand. Since 2014, Russia has settled large numbers of migrants on the peninsula. To this was added the military personnel who arrived with the war. The second, and the truly decisive one, is logistics. The Kerch Bridge can no longer fully perform its role as the main transport artery. Sea routes are under constant threat. The land road passing through occupied territory is regularly within range of Ukrainian drones. Ukraine's National Resistance Center summed the picture up bluntly. Russia is, in practice and step by step, losing the ability to meet the occupied peninsula's logistical needs at the customary volume. In the center's words, Crimea has begun to resemble an island where delivering fuel, goods and resources grows steadily harder. The fuel and food crises were severe, but what really brought the peninsula to its knees was the third blow: electricity and water. To understand the water, one fact is enough. Crimea is not a place that can produce its own water. The peninsula is an arid steppe. It owes its arability and habitability to the North Crimean Canal built by the Soviets. Drawing the Dnipro River's water from the Kakhovka Dam and carrying it to the peninsula, this 400-kilometer canal alone supplied up to 85% of Crimea's fresh water needs. Ukraine cut the water after the annexation in 2014. In 2022, Russian troops blew up the barrier and restarted the flow, but when the Kakhovka Dam was destroyed in June 2023, the mouth of the canal dried up for good. Since that day, the peninsula has depended entirely on its own sources, reservoirs and wells. But according to experts, these local sources can cover only about 15% of the need. In short, Crimea was already on a knife's edge as it entered the summer of 2026, and it was at exactly this point that the second, far more sudden blow came. There was only one thing holding this fragile water system up: electricity. Drawing from wells, pumping from reservoirs to cities, treating it, all of it means pumps, and pumps mean electricity. Ukraine targeted precisely that electricity. The combined cycle thermal power plant in Simferopol was struck 3 separate times between June 20th and 25th. Then, not only the plant, but the substations tied to it came under continuous attack. In Sevastopol, the intensity of the strikes reached an entirely different level. Robert Brovdy, commander of Ukraine's unmanned systems forces, confirmed that they hit the city's main substation 7 times in a single night. The result is visible in the peninsula's nights. The message coming from northern Crimea was a single sentence: no light at all, everywhere is dark. The numbers confirm it. According to The Guardian's analysis, more than 70% of the peninsula's roughly 2.5 million residents experienced some form of power outage. Many were left without electricity and water for days on end. The outage schedules also varied by location. In Yalta, 3 hours of power, 3 hours of darkness. In some parts of the southern coast, the ratio deteriorated badly. 2 hours of power, 10 hours of cuts. In Sevastopol, 2 hours of electricity followed a 6-hour cut, until the administration admitted it couldn't even guarantee those 2 hours. In Belogorsk, a resident wrote that the town had been without power for more than 70 hours, and that they were being given promises constantly. And on July 15th, the entire city of Kerch was plunged into darkness. And this is exactly where the water cuts come in. Crimea's state water company, Voda Krim, announced that water pressure would remain low in 9 districts because of the power outages. Sevastopol Governor Razvozhayev laid it out even more plainly. Water supply in the city would return to normal only once the power grid stabilized. So, water was no longer a water problem, it was directly an electricity problem. Aksionov's statement on this picture was a single sentence: at present, it is not possible to draw up a schedule that distributes electricity evenly across Crimea. When the power went, communications took a heavy blow too. The base stations ran on electricity as well. When the grid went down, the towers fell silent too. But there was a darker reason as well. Russia installed signal jammers in the region to confuse incoming Ukrainian drones, but those jammers blinded civilian communications along with the drones. The result was seen most clearly in Jankoy in the north. The mobile network in the city no longer works continuously. It is switched on only twice a day in 4-hour windows. And the occupation administration's solution to this problem became perhaps the most symbolic moment of the whole crisis. They began installing payphones on city streets. The first units were placed in Jankoy, then another was installed in Theatre Square in the center of Yevpatoria. In the 21st century, on a peninsula of 2.5 million people, emergency communication has gone back to the payphone. But the severing of communications wasn't merely a connectivity problem, because the modern economy runs on the same cable. When the power and the connection went, banks closed their branches, ATMs stopped, and electronic payment systems ceased to work. The scene that best captures what this means in daily life came from the Rozdolny district. According to residents, the district had neither electricity nor communications nor water. The only places still open were the shops with enough gasoline to run a generator, and they accepted only cash. People came to Rozdolny from surrounding villages to withdraw cash, but returned empty-handed because the ATMs weren't working and the banks were closed. On the transport side, the picture was no different. The outages disrupted public transport. Trolleybus service between Simferopol and Alushta was suspended. On the route still running, ticket prices rose by more than 100%. A quick break. Liking, a one-word comment, and subscribing directly help this video reach far more people, because now we move to how all of this brought the peninsula's economy down. The backbone of Crimea's economy was a single thing: summer tourism. And that short season provided the lion's share of the year's income for thousands of businesses and families on the peninsula. But this sector had a fatal weakness. Because scheduled commercial flights to the peninsula haven't operated for years, the overwhelming majority of tourists came to Crimea by their own car or by bus. When the fuel was cut, that link snapped too. According to data from the Russian hotel management platform Traveline, bookings across Crimea fell 31% between May 24th and June 6th. In Sevastopol, the drop reached 40%. But the truly striking part wasn't the decline in new bookings, it was the cancellation of existing ones. In the same period, 79% of bookings in Crimea and 71% of those in Sevastopol were cancelled. Tourists' greatest fear was being stranded on the peninsula. Transport itself was narrowing too. Crimean railways cut the number of daily trains to and from the peninsula from 18 to 7. Aksionov announced that new placements at youth camps and recreation facilities on the peninsula were suspended until September 1st. Bookings made at the famous Artek facility were cancelled as well. The season's total bill is enormous. According to the Russian Union of Tour Operators, roughly 1 million trips booked to Crimea and Sevastopol were cancelled. The value of the cancelled bookings is calculated at 20 to 25 billion rubles. And this isn't just lost revenue, it's a liability crisis. Because tour companies have to refund tourists, and many are in no position to cover it. Indeed, the Tourism Ministry of the Occupation Administration in Crimea characterized the mass cancellations as force majeure. Moscow, meanwhile, has had to open its wallet. The Russian government allocated more than 4,300 million rubles from its reserve fund directly to support the tourism sector in Crimea and Sevastopol. The money was announced as going to the employees of more than 4,600 tourism businesses left in difficulty by Ukrainian strikes. But what really shook the peninsula wasn't the tourists who didn't come, it was those who left. On June 24th, images from Planet Labs satellites revealed an enormous line of vehicles stretching toward the Kerch Bridge. Starting at the Russian checkpoint and extending past the village of Ivanivka, the queue ran more than 10 kilometers. Analysts examining the imagery estimated that roughly 1,500 vehicles were trying to leave the peninsula at the time. By the evening of June 25th, the queue's length had reached at least 15 kilometers. And on the night of June 26th, traffic on the bridge was halted entirely for a period. Official figures confirmed this picture too. More than 2,400 vehicles were queued on the Kerch side of the bridge, and the wait to exit the peninsula reached roughly 5 hours. But the truly striking detail wasn't the length of the queue, it was the opposite direction. Because at the same hours, on the Taman side of the bridge, the direction entering Crimea from Russia, there were almost no vehicles. According to an Institute for the Study of War Analysis, the departure of these groups from the peninsula could even produce demographic consequences in the long run. And looking at the order of departures, it's clear the first to go were not ordinary people. According to the pro-Ukrainian Atesh partisan network, an urgent order reached the occupation administrations in Kerch and Feodosia from the center. Valuable documents and technical equipment were to be evacuated by July 3rd. In the same period, officials began going on leave en masse and heading to the Krasnodar region. What's more, it was claimed that some officials crossed into Russia using state fuel whose sale to the civilian population had been halted. The heaviest document in this picture emerged a few days later. The pro-Ukrainian group called Void published an urgent coded telegram bearing the signature of Admiral Sergei Pinchuk, commander of Russia's Black Sea Fleet and head of the Sevastopol regional garrison. The order was clear. Military units and institutions were to collect information on the families of personnel and civilian employees, prepare evacuation lists, and submit them by July 10th at the latest. The scope of the order was notable too. Not just the sailors on the ships, but every military and administrative unit in the Sevastopol garrison was included in the lists. And this order didn't fall from the sky. It was the last link in a chain that had been working for months. The chain's first link appeared in April. Atesh reported that panic had broken out in the fleet's units and that senior officers were moving their families out of the region. The second link was in mid-June. The same network reported that plans were being prepared to relocate the fleet's remaining command structures in Sevastopol to Novorossiysk. So much so that some officers, without waiting for a formal order, began arranging their families' relocation and selling the belongings they couldn't take. Then, in July, came the written order. A rumor, an intelligence report, an official document. 3 separate steps, all pointing the same way: out. The departure of ordinary people, meanwhile, reaches much farther. It's reported that some families leaving the peninsula have returned to their old homelands, such as the Siberian city of Barnaul, more than 3,000 kilometers away. Because a significant portion of them were Russians who settled in Crimea after 2014 with incentives, now they were going back where they came from. So far, we've talked about consequences: empty shelves, dark cities, queues, families leaving. But how was all of this done? Ukraine's goal is to turn Crimea into an island, and the way to reach that goal was to close, all at once, the 4 gates connecting the peninsula to Russia: the sea, the bridge, the railway, and the highway. The biggest blow came from the sea. The operation that began on July 6th was named Molochka. And the name wasn't chosen at random. It is made from the initials of a Ukrainian phrase, Moscow will fall through Crimea. That is also what set this operation apart from earlier ones. Ukraine had previously targeted warships in the Black Sea. This time the targets weren't military, but commercial. Tankers, dry cargo ships, ferries, and tugboats. Why commercial vessels? The answer is hidden in Russia's method of moving oil. Russia's ports on the Sea of Azov are too shallow for large tankers to enter, so the oil is first loaded onto small and mid-sized ships known as feeder tankers. These vessels pass through the Volga-Don Canal and the shallow waters of the Azov, then transfer their cargo to the large tankers waiting on the far side of the Kerch Strait. In other words, the entire system depends on these small ships, and Ukraine targeted exactly that link. By July 20th, the number of vessels struck had risen to 183. The picture on the ferry line is even clearer. Of the 5 ferries serving the Kerch Strait, 3 were completely destroyed. The remaining 2 lost the ability to move under their own power. They are now used as barges towed by tugboats. The result is a 75% drop in ferry capacity. The numbers also show what this line meant. Before the operation, these ferries carried between 180 and 250 vehicles a day, and roughly 80% of those vehicles served the Russian military directly. And the result was visible in the sea itself. While there were more than 100 vessels around the Kerch Strait at the start of the operation, by July 19th, that number had fallen to roughly 12. Under this pressure, Moscow closed both critical passages opening onto the Sea of Azov, the Don-Azov Canal connecting to the inland waterways, and the Kerch Strait opening onto the Black Sea. The cost of this isn't only Crimea's fuel. The Sea of Azov is also a vital corridor for Russia's non-sanctioned exports, such as wheat and sunflower oil. On the commercial side, there's another quiet but effective blow. According to Russian media, the damage to vessels grew so great that insurance companies have begun refusing to insure Russian ships heading into the Azov and Black Seas. Once the sea was closed, it was the turn of the other 3 gates. Kerch is technically open, but non-functional. Because carrying hazardous materials such as fuel became too risky, the passage of heavy freight trucks was banned entirely. On the railway side, the lines broke one by one. The Chonhar Bridge was struck repeatedly, the Jankoy station shifted to transit mode, and the number of daily trains arriving on the peninsula fell from 18 to 7. On the highway, Ukraine established de facto fire control over the R280. That is, without closing the road, it made every vehicle crossing it a risk. The scale of these 4 gates closing at once is confirmed by independent data too. According to figures compiled by the conflict monitoring organization ACLED and The Economist, of the 692 attacks that have taken place in Crimea since 2022, more than half occurred in the last 12 months, and 1/5 since June alone. The most concrete answer is military, and here a critical misunderstanding needs correcting. Ukraine's real target is not Crimea itself. Ukrainian military expert Alexander Kovalenko explains it clearly. For the Ukrainian military, the peninsula isn't an objective, it's a transit hub affecting the entire occupied south. Isolating Crimea logistically means cutting the artery feeding not just the peninsula, but an entire front. This is a supply line that starts at the Kerch Bridge, runs through the isthmuses, crosses the lands of Kherson and Zaporizhia to Berdyansk, and from there to Mariupol. So when Crimea is choked, Russia's entire southern front line comes under threat. And that was exactly Brovdy's pledge. In the near future, we will isolate Crimea. This strategy has a history too. Ukraine began its strikes on the peninsula in the summer of 2023, after Russia started using it as a base for airstrikes, missiles and drones against Ukraine. At that time, they managed to force the Russian Navy and Air Force to pull back. This year's campaign aims at something different: Russia's ability to deliver forces and materiel to the front. According to data compiled by independent Russian media, 270 attacks on Russian trucks and logistics hubs were recorded this year alone. The second answer is political: the negotiating table. The assessment of military analyst Rob Lee, speaking to The Guardian, is very clear on this. In his view, by targeting Crimea, long considered by the Kremlin the most precious jewel of Putin's rule, Ukraine hopes to strengthen its hand in future peace talks. In Lee's words, because Ukraine can now reliably strike almost any target in Crimea, it has far more bargaining power in negotiations than before. The third answer is symbolic, and for Putin, this may be the heaviest of all. Because the 2014 annexation sharply raised Putin's approval ratings. The return of Crimea ceremonies held for years became carefully staged displays of Russian military power and national revival. In 2024, on Red Square, Putin himself said Crimea is often referred to as an unsinkable aircraft carrier. Everything told so far may appear to point in a single direction, but reading this picture one-sidedly would be a serious error, because the Kremlin still holds cards. First and most important, Crimea is still under Russian occupation. However severe the fuel crisis, the darkness, and the exodus, the peninsula is still under Moscow's military control. Second, the depots are not empty as of today. Russian forces are believed to hold considerable fuel and food reserves on the peninsula. Replenishing them will now be far slower, but in the short term, the military has stock in hand. Third, Moscow is making counter-moves. Belitsky, the governor appointed to Zaporizhia, reported to Putin that the R280 highway carrying supplies to Crimea is now fully under their control. By his claim, the Russian military had developed new defensive techniques against unmanned aerial vehicles. He did not explain what those techniques are, but it's clear Russia is trying to adapt. Fourth, the picture at the front is not one-sided. While all this was happening in Crimea, Russian forces continued to advance on the battlefield, slowly but steadily. Fifth, and perhaps most important, there is an enormous difference between besieging and capturing. Making a region unlivable from a distance is not the same as landing troops there and planting a flag. Ukraine's major counteroffensive in 2023 aimed at precisely this land corridor and failed. Today, too, Ukraine's ground forces are in a hard fight on the main fronts, and manpower shortages limit large ground operations. There's also the question of sources. A significant portion of the figures in this video, the vessel counts, the drop in ferry capacity, the evacuation documents, comes from Ukrainian military and intelligence sources and has not been independently verified. By contrast, the blackouts, water cuts, and fuel quotas are confirmed by the occupation administration's own statements. So the existence of the crisis is solid, its scale is disputed. And finally, the thing most easily forgotten, there are people beneath this picture. A hospital left in the dark, a neighborhood left without water, a shopkeeper who lost the season. These are the lives of ordinary people living in Crimea. Likewise, Ukrainian cities have lived through the same darkness and the same thirst under Russian strikes for 4 years. In this war, energy infrastructure is a target on both sides, and on both sides, it is civilians who pay the bill first. That is why the realistic expectation is not a Russian withdrawal in the near term. What's expected through the summer and autumn of 2026 is gradual attrition. For 12 years, Crimea was told to Russia as a promise, safe, sunny, a permanent victory. The place they called the unsinkable aircraft carrier. Today, the lights on that ship aren't on, its taps don't run, its tank is empty, and its crew is waiting in the exit queue. And Crimea's story also tells where this war is heading. The front lines have stood in roughly the same place for months. The real struggle is happening not on the map, but in the infrastructure. Whoever can cut the other's electricity, fuel, and logistics for longer will see the balance shift their way over time. The signals to watch are clear. Whether the turbines at Balaclava can be repaired, whether the ferry line will run again, whether heavy freight will be allowed across the Kirk Bridge, and whether those evacuation lists stay on paper. Because holding a territory isn't measured by the flag flying over it. If the lights aren't on, if the taps aren't running, and if people are packing their suitcases, then that territory has already become something else, not an asset, but a wound.
There is no water delivery, there's no help, even with charging phones and stations, who had some sort of budget to buy these small stations.
For years, Crimea was Putin's guarantee of power, but now that guarantee is slipping out of his hands. For a decade, this peninsula was sold to the world in a single way: untouchable. Russia's sacred crown, the land Moscow would sacrifice anything to hold. But in the summer of 2026, that fairy tale is collapsing before our eyes, piece by piece. Crimea is pitch dark at night right now, power gone for days, water running only a few hours a day in some areas, phones with no outlet to charge, businesses shutting down. And the most striking part, the Russians who moved here for years calling it paradise, now console themselves with dreams of going back. Except they can't, because there isn't even gasoline left in their cars. More than 1 million Russians settled on this peninsula at Putin's call. Today, those same people are inside an abandoned siege, waking every night to the sound of explosions. Ukraine's drones have locked on to one of the war's most ambitious objectives: to tear a peninsula away from Russia and turn it into an island, without ever conquering it. In this video, we'll examine how Ukraine cut Crimea off from Russia, why this peninsula is Putin's greatest weakness, and the great collapse awaiting the Kremlin if Crimea falls. But before we begin, a small request. Independent war and geopolitics analysis like this has lately been suppressed by the algorithm, and the video doesn't reach many of the people who'd want it. Subscribing, liking the video, and leaving even a single word in the comments directly helps us break through that. Now, let's start with that peninsula sinking into darkness. First, we need to see the real scale of that darkness. In July, in one of the most ambitious single-night strikes the war had seen to that point, Ukraine left the entire Crimean peninsula without power. This isn't a small region, a landmass of roughly 2.5 million people, the size of Wales or Vermont, dropped off the grid in a single night. But it isn't about one night either. This is part of a systematic campaign. The campaign even has its own name, Operation Molochka, which began on July 6th, hit more than 50 energy nodes across the peninsula in its first week alone, struck 6 substations in a single night, and targeted the sea alongside the land. Within 72 hours, a ferry, a dry cargo ship, and 19 tankers belonging to Russia's shadow fleet at Kerch. The result was a disaster even the Russian side couldn't hide. The administrator Russia installed in Crimea admitted they could no longer even provide a reliable power outage schedule, and a state of emergency was declared for the peninsula. The power crisis soon struck something far more basic: water. Since Crimea's water distribution network runs on electricity, once the grid collapsed, the occupation administration's water authority had to reduce pressure or cut it off entirely across 9 separate regions. So a peninsula lost its light, its water, and its communications all at once, in a single campaign. So what does this darkness mean for the people living there? The most striking face of this crisis isn't in the statistics, it's in the words of the ordinary people living there. In a widely circulated video, a Russian settler, after praising Crimea's comfort, eliminates the places he could return to one by one. He doesn't want to go to Sochi, Krasnodar is too crowded, Moscow's pace is insane, and ends his words in despair. Honestly, I don't know what to do now.
I don't want to go to Sochi. What the hell?
This is the summary of the mood on the peninsula. Staying is hard, but leaving is no longer an option either. Since life in occupied Crimea has turned into a basic struggle for survival. In one settler's account, there's been no power for a week, water comes only a few hours a day, companies are closing, mass layoffs have begun over the electricity, and people can't even find a place to charge their phones.
There is no water delivery, there's no help, even with charging phones and stations, who had some sort of budget to buy these small stations.
But perhaps the most human face of this collapse is in the words of a mother with a 4-month-old baby. That mother describes being forced to wake every night to the sound of explosions, with air defense unable to stop the strikes. And she rebels against the calls to increase the population. First, let this population survive and live a little. The bitter irony in these words is layered. The Kremlin spent years calling on Russians to move here and grow the population, but now it can't even protect that population. This is the moment the untouchable paradise image the Kremlin built for years collapses. The gulf between the peaceful Crimea on the propaganda posters and the real Crimea waking in darkness every night can no longer be bridged. Most of these people thought they were moving into a paradise, not into a war. Now they're realizing they're living on the front line itself. But to understand why this picture matters so much, one question has to be answered. Why did 1 million people move here? Without grasping what Crimea means to Putin, the weight of this crisis can't be understood either. Since the 2014 occupation, Russia moved an enormous population onto this peninsula. According to Ukraine's official assessments, the number of new people relocated here is roughly 1 million. This wasn't ordinary migration, but a deliberate state project. On one hand, Russian officials, soldiers, judges, and their families were settled here with privileged loans, and on the other, native Ukrainians were pressured into leaving. The tools of this policy were very concrete: advantageous housing loans for Russians, the relocation of military and law enforcement personnel along with their families, and the deportation or forced emigration of the local population. So much so that this resettlement has been characterized in some assessments as a violation of international humanitarian law, an occupier deliberately altering the demographics of the land it seized. The result is a chilling demographic transformation. In a region of roughly 2.5 million people, more than 35% of the residents were replaced over a decade of occupation. So Putin Russified Crimea not only militarily, but in its human fabric. Every new settler was a brick in making the occupation permanent. And Russia tried to repeat this model in the other Ukrainian lands it occupied after 2022, but was far less successful because of the ongoing war. Crimea was the most mature example of this demographic engineering. This is why Crimea isn't an ordinary piece of land for the Kremlin, the greatest victory narrative of 2014, a living symbol of the regime's power and the cornerstone of Putin's personal prestige. The Kremlin marketed this peninsula for years as one of Russia's most attractive regions. It erected the massive Kerch Bridge as the concrete monument to that victory. But Crimea's value wasn't only symbolic. The peninsula was also the most critical military base on Russia's southern flank. Sevastopol is the main port of Russia's Black Sea Fleet, and Crimea's airfields, air defense systems, and logistics hubs were the rear base for all of Russia's operations in southern Ukraine. In one military assessment's phrasing, Crimea served for years as an unsinkable aircraft carrier for Russia, a fixed military platform in the middle of the Black Sea, reaching into Ukraine's south. So Crimea was, for Putin, a prestige symbol, a demographic project, and a military fortress all at once. 3 separate weights on a single peninsula. But it's exactly this triple weight that makes Crimea today not a strength, but a weakness. Since if there's someone who can cut the light, water and fuel of a peninsula on which you've made 1 million people dependent, deployed your most valuable fleet, and fed an entire southern front, then that peninsula is no longer your greatest showcase, but your greatest burden. And Ukraine targeted exactly this, collapsing the peninsula from within without conquering it. To understand Ukraine's Crimea strategy, you have to look at the framework of an experienced military commander. According to a Western retired general, Crimea is the decisive anchor of the whole war. Whoever controls this peninsula ultimately wins the war. And the genius of the strategy is here. Ukraine doesn't need to retake Crimea by conquering it directly in a bloody ground assault. In that same general's framework, you first have to isolate the peninsula by striking the bridges, fuel ships and ferries, and by collapsing the logistics line running from the mainland to Crimea. The next step is to make it untenable by striking everything the Russians hold on the peninsula: naval bases, airfields, air defense systems, radars, logistics hubs. So Crimea stops being a military launching pad. Ukraine's Unmanned Systems Forces commander summed up this logic in a single sentence: the Crimean switch is off. In his words, the goal isn't only to cut the power, it's the total collapse of air defense, logistics, and fuel shortages, and the gradual isolation of the Russian military presence on the peninsula. The ultimate objective being the complete exodus of colonizers and collaborators from there. This strategy is being applied exactly on the ground. The land corridor connecting Russia to Crimea, that vital road descending from the Sea of Azov to the peninsula, is now under Ukraine's fire control. So much so that this route is called the Highway of Death. A critical section of this road has effectively become closed to all but military traffic. Ukrainian drones constantly strike the convoys moving along this line, and much of the road is unusable. In parallel, Ukraine closed the sea route. By targeting fuel-carrying ships and tankers belonging to Russia's Shadow Fleet, it choked the flow of fuel to the peninsula by sea as well. This is done not with a single type of weapon, but with a layered capability. Short, medium, and long-range drones and missiles are used together, and each layer strikes a different target. One a substation, one a tanker, one the logistics line on the mainland. This is exactly what one military assessment highlights. Ukraine is conducting this campaign so comprehensively and thoroughly that it targets every supply artery running to the peninsula at once and systematically. So land, sea, and energy, Every vein connecting Crimea to Russia is being squeezed at once. The genius of this strategy is in avoiding the cost of a direct ground assault. Ukraine doesn't need to drive tens of thousands of its soldiers onto the peninsula for a bloody landing. In that same retired general's framework, once you make a peninsula untenable, you can force Russia to withdraw without any need for a direct landing. The logic is simple but merciless. A military base that can't feed itself becomes indefensible. Tanks with no fuel can't move, radars with no power can't see, a garrison with no resupply can't fight, and a peninsula can't keep an army standing without constant feeding from outside. This is why the energy strikes target not only civilians, but directly the Russian military presence. When the local Russian administration in Crimea and the people living there can't find fuel for their vehicles or generators, that pressure feeds directly into military capacity too. So the darkness paralyzing civilian life and the logistical collapse paralyzing the Russian army are two sides of the same coin. As Crimea stops being a military base, Russia's entire hand on the southern front weakens. A peninsula is being turned, step by step, into an island, and an island that can't be fed from outside surrenders sooner or later. But one thing stands out in this whole picture. Ukraine still hasn't destroyed its biggest and most symbolic target, the Kerch Bridge. Why? The Kerch Bridge still standing isn't a weakness, but a calculated choice. According to that same retired general's assessment, Ukraine is deliberately leaving the bridge intact for now. There are several reasons for this, and they all lead to the same strategy. First, the bridge has already largely lost its function. Since the Russians fear a freight train being struck with fuel or ammunition, as in the first strikes, they now avoid moving heavy military logistics across the bridge. This fear has a history. Ukraine has struck the bridge twice before, and the Russians fear a strike timed exactly as a freight train passes, creating an extra explosion. So much so that even every ship passing under the bridge had to get permission from the authorities, since the Russians are terrified Ukraine could seize a ship and ram it into the bridge's supports or blow it up while it's under the bridge. So even though the bridge is physically standing, as a military supply line it's largely paralyzed. The enormous effort to destroy it may not be worth the added benefit it would bring. Second, and even more important, the isolation is already working. Ukraine achieves the effect of making Crimea untenable even without destroying the bridge, by striking the ferries, fuel ships, and land convoys. The consequences of this are laid bare in daily life. When the mobile network collapsed, public landline phones had to be installed on the streets in some cities so people could reach emergency services. The generators handed out to blacked-out neighborhoods don't run because no fuel can be found, and tourists who came by car to this resort town, where Russians once flocked for the summer sun, are stranded because they can't find gasoline to return. So much so that a Russian blogger openly advised vacationers not to go to Crimea, the most concrete proof of how deeply the isolation works even with the bridge still standing. So the real aim isn't to destroy the bridge, but to render the peninsula useless, and this is achieved even while the bridge stands. On top of that, the bridge has a symbolic dimension too. The Kerch Bridge is the most visible monument to Putin's Crimea victory, the concrete form of his personal pride, and a giant project that cost $4 billion. This is why its destruction may be being saved as a psychological turning point rather than a military event, as the final blow to crown Crimea's fall. That same retired general implies this too. Ukraine will eventually bring the bridge down, since it wants to permanently stop Russia from controlling passage through the Kerch Strait. But it will do so at a moment of its own choosing. This shows the maturity of Ukraine's strategy. Instead of striking the flashiest target and making headlines, it patiently and systematically hollows out the peninsula. And this patient siege is part of a much larger military picture. This collapse in Crimea isn't an isolated event, it's part of a much larger picture in which the war's overall balance has shifted in Ukraine's favor. In that same retired general's phrasing, over the last several months, the momentum has clearly shifted to Ukraine. One of the most concrete proofs of this is the Black Sea Fleet, which Russia once mentioned with pride. That fleet was so worn down by Ukraine's naval drones and missiles that it had to withdraw from its main base in Sevastopol and stopped being a decisive factor in the war. The meaning of this is striking. Like a land army with no sea, a fleet that can't use its main base loses its deterrence. Sevastopol, which symbolized Russia's power in the Black Sea for over a century, isn't even a safe harbor anymore. Ukraine tearing an entire fleet out of its main base with drones and missiles, without a serious navy of its own, is a development that rewrites the rules of modern war too. On land, the picture isn't bright for Russia either. According to Ukraine's command, Russia's rate of advance fell by more than half in the first half of the year compared to last year, and the two sides have nearly equalized in the pace of advance. One of the biggest factors behind this is Ukraine's edge in drone production. In short-range drone production, Ukraine's ratio against Russia rose above 1.5 last month. The meaning of this ratio is directly tied to the blackout in Crimea. Those drones darkening Crimea night after night are the product of exactly this production edge. The more drones Ukraine makes, the more its capacity to strike the peninsula grows. And this drone campaign isn't limited to Crimea. The same long-range strike capability targets Russia's oil and gas infrastructure too, cutting the lifeblood of the war economy. In that same retired general's phrasing, this isn't only a matter of the long gas queues across Russia. It's also about wrecking Russia's economy as a whole. Its capacity to sustain the war is being severely damaged. There's a human cost completing this picture too. Since the start of the war, Russia's losses have approached 1.5 million, and according to a war research institution, Russia recruits roughly 27,000 soldiers a month, while losing about 30,000. So the blackout in Crimea is part, not of a single front, but of an entire war strategy, a clamp squeezing Russia on the ground, at sea, economically, and in manpower all at once. This doesn't mean Russia is helpless, of course. Moscow still rains deadly ballistic missiles on Ukrainian cities, and Ukraine can't yet stop all of them. That same general draws this line clearly too. Ukraine isn't yet able to stop all the ballistic missiles Russia launches at civilian targets, and this means the death of innocent civilians. But the general direction is clear. The momentum has been flowing in Ukraine's favor for months, and all this momentum points to a single outcome. The aim of the drone operators on the ground isn't only to black out an energy grid, it's to dissolve, step by step, the demographic foundation of an occupation, that wall of settlers Putin built with 1 million people. And where this current is heading is a nightmare for Putin. History is full of examples of this. Authoritarian regimes are often shaken not by a gradual collapse, but by a spark in which the myth of invincibility breaks all at once. And the moment the people see that the leader thought untouchable can also make mistakes, the wall of fear begins to crack. This is why the darkness in Crimea is far bigger than a single regional crisis. The fading lights of 1 million settlers are also the fading of Putin's most valuable myth. Every Crimean settler waking in darkness today is, in fact, learning through experience that the untouchable paradise tale is no longer real. And this learning is the most dangerous propaganda collapse for the Kremlin, since these people are learning it not from a Western news source, but from their own daily lives, from their dead bulbs, their dry taps, their empty tanks. A state that convinced 1 million people to, "Come here, this is paradise," now can't keep that promise before those very people's eyes. And a disillusioned settler is a witness at least as dangerous as an enemy. And once a myth cracks, restoring it, just like bringing back cut power, grows harder by the day. So do you think Ukraine can really retake Crimea with this isolation strategy?
There's a 3-kilometer line. Why won't they let us through? I just don't get it. They brought us here yesterday, filled up our tanks, but now they won't let us go.
A brutal uprising has erupted on the streets of Russia. As the gas stations have descended into chaos, turning into fighting rings, Ukraine's drone campaign against Russian refineries has plunged the country into a shortage unseen since the final years of the Soviet Union. From Crimea to Moscow, from St. Petersburg to Siberia, 146 million Russians are being dragged toward a societal catastrophe by a sweeping fuel, food, and logistics crisis engulfing the entire country. Now, on one side, fuel lines are becoming battlegrounds, while on the other, shelves are emptying across whole regions, and the supply of fuel, electricity, water, and food is breaking down. And the public, losing its faith in Putin, has begun to turn sharply against the regime. The entire narrative of stability that Putin has propped up for 25 years is on the verge of collapsing from within. But before we get into why this crisis feeds itself and where winter could take Russia, a small request. Independent war and economics analysis like this has lately been suppressed by the algorithm, and the video isn't reaching many of the people who would want to see it. Subscribing, liking the video, and leaving even a single word in the comments directly helps us break through that suppression. Now, back to the head of the line. Let's start with the scale, because most people can't imagine how bad it is. The rationing has now spread to nearly the entire country. 78 of 83 regions have moved to a ration system, only 5 remain untouched. And according to a Financial Times analysis, this crisis directly hits 50 million people, roughly a third of the population. It is the largest scale fuel collapse of the post-Soviet era. Just how deep a collapse that number describes is something you only need to hear from a Russian's own mouth. A man who set out to see for himself whether the crisis had truly struck the country was left frozen by what he found.
Anyway, this isn't an artificial shortage, guys. That's what I wanted to tell you. We're screwed, to put it mildly. We're screwed. All the refineries there are destroyed. And how long it'll take to rebuild them, for them to resume operations and oil refining. In short, for them to get that gasoline and diesel. Well, no one knows how long that'll take. So what lies ahead for us?
What's more, the places being hit are no ordinary provinces. Moscow and St. Petersburg alone house nearly a quarter of the country's population, Russia's 2 most privileged, most insulated metropolises. The comfort of the Kremlin elite rested on the war never reaching the doorstep of these 2 cities, and now, right there, in the city where Putin was born, burning depots stand side by side with fuel lines. The form of rationing shifts from place to place. In some regions, odd even days by license plate. In others, a capped number of litres per vehicle. In Belgorod, acting Governor Shuvayev announced he had cut the purchase limit to 30 litres and warned bluntly, "This is only the beginning."
Dear residents, we're monitoring localized disruptions in the availability and distribution of certain fuel grades at some gas stations. Overall, the situation remains stable and under control. We are currently paying special attention to municipalities along the border. These are the areas the enemy is specifically targeting with its attacks. To ensure there is enough fuel for everyone, we are implementing a temporary limit. No more than 30 litres of gasoline and 60 litres of diesel fuel per person per refueling.
The crisis has spread deep into Siberia, and every city has produced its own scene of collapse. In Omsk, the 53-station local chain, Topline, halted sales entirely. Its screens show zeros instead of prices. In Novosibirsk, one station set a record by pushing gasoline to 170 rubles a litre. In Transbaikal, the picture is grimmer still. It's 200 kilometers to Chita. People have already been waiting 3 days. When wholesale supply was cut, independent stations shut down en masse, leaving only the state giants. And in some cities, the lines locked up even public transport. Analyst Maglin's line sums up the whole picture. For 4 years, Russians in the big cities could watch this war from a distance. The fuel line closed that distance in an instant. This desperation spills out in the ugliest forms, and the place hit hardest is Crimea. From June 21st, all sales to individuals and businesses were halted. According to regional head Aksionov, fuel was reserved only for state services that ensure the functioning and security of the republic. In practice, that means gasoline was closed off to civilians and reserved for the army, the municipality, and those close to power. On June 26th, a state of emergency was declared, coupons were suspended, the tourism season was pushed back to September 1st, and a 100-litre cap per vehicle was imposed on crossings over the Kerch Bridge. The words of one Crimean resident capture the siege.
It's total chaos. Last night, the city was attacked by drones. The investigative committee has opened a terrorism case, and all trains heading toward Crimea are being stopped.
Crimea being hit this hard is no accident either. An annexed symbol, the base of the Black Sea Fleet, one of Moscow's most sensitive points. For the civilian life of such a strategic place to effectively stop multiplies the political weight of the crisis. For a regime that cannot keep the lights on, even in the land it shows off most, cannot hide that failure. And those left without fuel don't meet this with passive resignation. The logic of the anger can be summed up in a single sentence. If I don't have it, you won't either.
There's a 3-kilometer line. Why won't they let us through? I just don't get it. They brought us here yesterday, filled up our tanks, but now they won't let us go. People have been fucking stuck there since last night. They're just falling asleep right there. It's 5 a.m. I'm driving over there, and there's already a 3-kilometer line. Or those jerks who walk over there, take pictures and say, gas is 100 rubles here, 115 rubles. For fuck's sake. Personally, I don't care. I just want to fill up and get to work.
Recordings of drivers slashing tires, smashing windows, going at each other in line are growing more frequent. The anger is looking for an outlet, and most often it finds the nearest person. And this isn't an isolated flare-up, but a pattern. According to Radio Free Europe, footage showing fights breaking out in hours-long lines is being shared one after another on social media. Different cities, always the same scene. Weeks pass, and the picture doesn't change. The brawl in the line has become the crisis's new normal. And once desperation crosses a threshold, people no longer just wait in line, they begin to hunt. The first new profession the crisis gave birth to was fuel piracy. Those who drill into the tanks of parked cars and siphon out the fuel, resell it on the black market at many times the price. It spread so widely that in the hardest hit regions, leaving a car unattended now means risking finding its tank drained. But it didn't stop at parked cars. The hopelessness of finding fuel drove drivers after the source itself. Some, the moment they spot a fuel tanker, latch on and follow it all the way to the station. And this fuel hunt grew more aggressive. When following wasn't enough, footage surfacing on social media claims desperate crowds have blocked trucks on the road and forced them to stop. At the far extreme is a scene beyond belief. Drivers in Novorossiysk, unable to fill their tanks for a week, effectively took a fuel tanker hostage. A city taking a fuel truck hostage is no longer a crime report. It's a bulletin of collapse. Even the line itself has turned into a fraud market. In reported cases, some impersonate police officers to jump the queue, while others sell their place in line for money. According to what's been reported, all of this has spread to at least 80 regions across Russia and Crimea. And these scenes share a common meaning. The shortage empties not only fuel tanks, but the unwritten rules that hold people together. When a society begins to see its neighbor's tank as prey, what is unraveling is no longer merely the fuel supply. The state's first response to this picture too was not to calm it, but to harden it. In Chelyabinsk, police were deployed to gas stations to keep order. St. Petersburg's transport authorities announced that owing to the fuel crisis, even emergency services like ambulances could falter, meaning the shortage now threatens even a person's chance of reaching a hospital. In the Pskov region, police began raiding private homes and garages on the grounds of hoarding fuel, issuing fines of 5,000 to 15,000 rubles under the pretext of fire safety. A state punishing its own citizens for stockpiling fuel is the clearest sign that scarcity has become a tool of governance. Another response to the crisis is perhaps the coldest. Those sitting on the sidelines realized someone else's plight was an opportunity for them. According to NPR and AP, some speculators in Crimea are selling fuel at twice the free market price. The methods are simple. Some siphon the gasoline out of the car of someone who waited for hours to fill up, then sell it at a markup to those with no intention of waiting. Just as in any trade, here too people chase efficiency. One person's hours-long ordeal is reduced to a few minutes profit opportunity for another. There are more advanced versions too. Some drivers have retrofitted their vehicles so that, while appearing to fill their own tank, they are actually filling hidden cans to sell. In less than a month, a brand new profession has emerged: ways to make money by stealing from your neighbor. How solidarity is unraveling is laid bare by a widely shared comment from a Muscovite. He complains that while soldiers are being lost at the front, he is wasting his time in a fuel line.
Надо ввести, наоборот, квоту на бензин, допустим, не знаю, 20 литров в неделю, да, там для регионов, там в месяц, там, ну, какую-то там определить, да, где мы можем получать бесплатный бензин. Вот. И убрать эти все очереди, блин, хотя бы в федеральных городах. Ну, реально, вот, уберите лимит из федеральных городов. Блять, ну это стыдно, живя в Москве.
So the crisis is consuming not only fuel, but the sense of us. The center writes off the provinces, the driver the next in line, and the state's own defense measures deepen this isolation. The internet and GPS cut region by region against the drone threat, sever ordinary people from their link to the outside world too. None of this is a surprise for Russia. It's a small-scale replay of how the country's richest men, the oligarchs, built their power. Those who grasped how the system worked as the Soviet Union collapsed seized state assets that should have been distributed equally to the people for next to nothing. Those men were aware they were wrecking their own societies, but didn't care. Their only concern was their own wealth. Today's small-scale replay at the edge of the line carries the same morality. When short-term individual gain takes precedence over shared prosperity, society weakens. And the scarcity is no longer only in the tank, it's on the table. The cut-off of fuel was a domino. Electricity, water, and food followed, most of all in the place farthest from Moscow and least protected, the occupied territories. The starkest picture, again, is in Crimea. On the peninsula, food, water, electricity, and gasoline ran out all at once. So much so that field kitchens were set up where people line up for a meal, in 21st century Europe, in a place that was once a holiday peninsula. The voices rising from the peninsula describe a siege. A Crimean woman recounts that there is no longer any fuel, electricity, or water left, that the shops have closed, and that much of the population has fled the peninsula. The shelves of chain supermarkets have emptied, supply has stopped. Finding fresh food has become a luxury in itself. In Yalta, a resident who has had no electricity for 8 days describes everything in the fridge spoiling, the shelves emptying fast, and prices soaring. One more step, he says, and this turns into a humanitarian disaster. And the authorities, exactly as expected, remain motionless. Donetsk, an older showcase of the occupation, is the most symbolic version of the same collapse. In the shops of a city that once hosted the European Football Championship, today there are only empty white shelves and lonely rows of canned jars. Residents have given it a bitter name. The real USSR is back. After more than a decade of occupation, even the city shown off as a showcase cannot feed its own people. And the true meaning of this picture is this: the legitimacy of a state is measured, in the end, not by abstract words, but by the shelf of a store, by water running from a tap, by a tank that can be filled. When those shelves empty, what collapses is not just the supply chain, but that state's very claim of, "I can protect you." So what is the state doing? The classic move, passing the problem down the line. Putin admitted the crisis. There are ongoing problems for drivers and businesses. Finding the right gasoline isn't always easy, he said. But he immediately added, "It's not critical, it's temporary." For a leader who sweeps everything under the rug to so much as name a problem is often a sign of just how large that problem is. The authorities' method for easing tension in the lines is chilling. To push more product to market, they lowered the standard. Euro 3 gasoline was permitted through year's end instead of Euro 5. The result shows up in mechanics' videos. Low-quality fuel is wrecking engines. Russian auto services have begun recording a sharp rise in requests from drivers, reporting breakdowns after filling up with this gasoline. Costly repairs to fuel systems and engines are on the way. So in the short term, the pressure eases a little. In the long term, the damage grows. And this time, the bill is paid directly by the driver. This is a classic pattern. Cutting off complaints in the short term at the cost of opening a far bigger problem for yourself in the long term. Throughout the war, Putin's answer to nearly every problem was exactly this: thinking of the lifespan not of society, but of his own hold on power. Russia has also closed its doors. Gasoline and jet fuel exports were banned through the end of July. A diesel ban is on the table. It's trying to cover the gap with imports from Belarus and India. Even halting its own exports is an admission in itself. One of the world's largest fuel sellers can no longer find enough gasoline for its own citizens. And the scale of that dependence is laid bare at the neighboring borders. According to Reuters, Belarus tripled its gasoline shipments to Russia in June, exceeding 181,000 tons. In the first half of 2026, the gasoline it supplied to Russia reached 453,000 tons. 20 times the same period last year. The oil empire is now begging a tiny neighbor for fuel. At the other border, the picture is even more striking. Because gasoline in Kazakhstan is nearly 1.5 times cheaper than in Russia, Russians in the border regions flocked there. So much so that Kazakhstan set up 59 police checkpoints along the border to stop smuggling and detected 392 illegal import attempts using hidden tanks. Meaning even a country pro-Russian in every other respect closes its border to Russian drivers when it comes to sharing its own fuel. And at the Russia-Belarus border, enormous lines formed that people said they had never seen before. This time, it was ordinary Russians crossing the border, leaving their country for fuel. But the real issue is that this time, the old cards are spent. Something similar happened last year, and Moscow used nearly every tool it had to recover. Last time's recipe, dumping the shortfall on neighboring countries, isn't working this time. That capacity has already been maxed out for months. The trouble at the root is this. Ukraine is getting steadily better at striking Russian refineries. By some assessments, this drone campaign has knocked out roughly 30% of Russia's refining capacity. The numbers show it most clearly. According to Reuters, the refinery in the capital likely won't be repaired until 2027. 80% of the capacity of the country's largest refinery has gone offline, with no estimate even for when it might recover. The damage is now cumulative, each day's new blow piling on top of unrepaired old ones. That is why the crisis erupted so fast. The refinery network was already loaded with accumulated damage, and demand could only be met through the summer. When consumption peaked, Ukraine launched its largest wave of strikes, and everything clogged at once. What's more, there is neither enough spare parts nor technical staff to bring these facilities back quickly. And this isn't a one-off blow, but a continuous campaign. Before repair crews can restore one facility, smoke is rising from the next. Russia is trapped in a race where the holes multiply as it tries to bail out a leaking boat. The China option is a trap in its own right. Russia has to sell crude to China cheap and buy the same product back, refined at a high price, losing on both transactions. A country that once used energy like a geopolitical weapon now finds itself, in that same equation, on the side where Beijing sets the price, one of the quietest strategic costs the war has imposed. Still, let's not paint the picture in one color. According to a sector expectation reported by Reuters, supply could ease somewhat toward the end of July. But that would be a temporary breath. The wound itself stays in place. And the real bad news is hidden in winter, for the crisis is biting its own tail. Scarcity leads to chaos, chaos to more scarcity. Every small act of desperation degrades supply a little further, and degraded supply breeds new desperation. By this video's central thesis, this is a trap. It doesn't fix itself, and the state's resources are limited too. Beneath this lies something deeper, the unraveling of the invisible glue that holds a society upright. Modern societies hold us together less by written laws than by unwritten rules, by the trust placed in the next person, by the expectation that everyone will go to their job. When these rules erode, trust erodes too, and an everyone for themselves mood spreads. Modern life rests on invisible systems most of us don't even know the names of, and these systems are so interdependent that when one falters, the effect quickly jumps to the others. At this point, one has to understand a silent bargain specific to Russia. In the post-Soviet era, there was an unwritten agreement between society and the state. The people largely gave up political freedoms. In return, the state guaranteed stability, order, and the uninterrupted flow of basic needs. This was the "you don't interfere with us, and we'll provide your prosperity" deal. But when one of the world's largest oil producers can no longer give its own citizen gasoline, or even bread, it has broken its own half of that bargain. Here is the real seed of the unrest. Today, the anger flows horizontally. Driver at the next driver, citizen at the local governor. But history shows this anger can turn vertical at a threshold. That is, it can lift its target from a local official and aim it directly at the top of power. That threshold is the moment people say, "This isn't a temporary glitch, the system itself is collapsing." And once that sentence spreads, it's nearly impossible to take back. Russia's own past is full of this lesson. Both in 1917 and in 1991, what toppled regimes was not armies or ideologies alone. It was the state becoming unable to provide the simplest thing: bread, heat, transport. Empires often begin to unravel not in moments of heroism in the squares, but with an emptying shelf in a store, with the gasoline running out at a station. After all, the people trust not a state's power, but its function. And when that function stops, fear slowly gives way to anger. That is why the real fracture is not the price at the pump or the length of the line. The real fracture is that silent social contract cracking, for the first time, before such a vast audience. And trust, once shaken, being the hardest, most expensive thing a state can rebuild. But the real test will come in winter. The refineries, running at their last strength all summer, may not find the time to switch safely to winter fuel formulas, meaning the shortage may not end even as the season changes. Worse, if farm machinery can't find enough diesel, the harvest is at risk, and a society that is only fuel-less today could become a hungry and cold one in winter. The empty shelves already visible in the occupied territories show that this possibility is not a forecast, but a rehearsal for the coming winter. The economic ground is already cracking. Inflation rose to 6% at the end of June. The 2026 growth forecast was cut to 0.4%, and according to Gallup, 60% of Russians say economic conditions have worsened, a record in a 20-year survey. The source of inflation is twofold. On one hand, money printing, on the other, the price of expensive fuel pushing up the tag on every product. And let's not pass without asking this question. If Russians who have merely gone without fuel for a month are already turning their backs on their government, what happens 6 months from now when they're genuinely cold and hungry? There is one more unknown in the equation. As an observer in Omsk pointed out, the tens of thousands of embittered veterans who will return from the front. A society going out of its mind in a fuel line, and an armed generation carrying the marks of war returning home in the same window. That is an equation hard for the Kremlin to calculate. A society can't stay standing when several legs of the stool it rests on break, and once you lose that balance, rebuilding it is far harder than toppling it. This awareness is already showing on people's faces. In footage shared from Stavropol, a woman says that even living in the 21st century, they can neither run their businesses nor put gasoline in their cars. The astonishment in her voice more striking than the anger. Experts don't expect a famine, but reaching products like eggs or fresh vegetables at all times, at any price, may grow steadily harder. Besides, these economic troubles were there before the crisis too. The fuel shortage isn't creating them, it's magnifying them all at once. The Russian economy was already on a knife's edge on many fronts, and fuel is sharpening that knife a little more. For the entire logic of a war economy rests on the uninterrupted flow of fuel. The tank at the front and the combine in the field feed from the same vein. And cracked voices are coming even from within the elite. Sberbank's chief, Gref, said there is no one left in the country whose primary concern isn't the military conflict ending as soon as possible, meaning the calm in the showcase no longer holds, even at the tables at the very top. In the end, this is neither a story of victory nor of defeat. It is the story of ordinary people paying the heaviest price for the war on both sides of the front. On one side, the Russian driver losing his mind in line. On the other, the Ukrainian civilian losing his home under Russian missiles. But the real sign to watch, in Russia's case, is not the brawls at the stations or the outrageous price at the pump. It is whether the anger shifts from local officials toward the top of the Kremlin. For an empire sitting on an ocean of oil to leave its own citizen dependent on a single tank of gasoline and, increasingly, on a single loaf of bread, is not merely a supply problem, but the cracking, before the eyes of millions, of the unwritten bargain that kept that country quiet for 4 years. And history shows that a state stands not by its power, but by its function. Once that function stops, the protector in the people's eyes slowly gives way to the one to blame for the chaos. And the day that threshold is crossed, this turns into an entirely different story. So do you think this food and fuel uprising will carry its anger from local governments to the top of the Kremlin and truly corner Putin, or will it be suppressed one way or another before winter arrives? The second arm of the siege is perhaps the one that hits civilian life most directly, the systematic collapse of the power grid. After months of systematic strikes on transformer stations at every voltage level across the peninsula, Crimea's electrical grid began to fall apart. The figures show the scale of the crisis clearly. According to Ukrainian intelligence, during a prolonged outage in July, about 1.5 million subscribers were left without electricity simultaneously. In some cities, the blackouts lasted more than a week. In some settlements, power could be supplied only for a few hours at night. How deep this collapse runs is visible even from space. According to an independent investigation, by late June, the peninsula's nighttime illumination had fallen to 1/5 of its normal level. Then, the strike on the Balaklava thermal power plant, which supplied about 1/3 of the peninsula's power generation, brought the region to the very brink of an energy catastrophe. A resort region that once glittered had now turned into a dark stain in satellite imagery. The loss of electricity triggered a chain collapse. With no power, the water pumps stopped. In many cities, water was supplied only a few hours a day, and in some districts, it was cut off entirely. With no refrigeration, food in the shops began to rot. Milk, meat, and fish vanished from the shelves. People began charging their phones from power strips wired to generators on the streets and washing their dishes with rainwater. Mobile networks collapsed. A peninsula Russia once proudly claimed was dragged into a struggle for survival, where even basic needs couldn't be met. And the bill for this energy crisis hit the ordinary person's pocket too. The fuel shortage reached such a point that a litre of gasoline climbed to 269 rubles and kept rising. Businesses began to close and mass layoffs began over the electricity. The tourist season collapsed entirely. The occupation administration was forced to set up emergency assistance centres and declare a state of emergency. There's a critical point here. This energy collapse is not an accident or a temporary glitch. Over months, Ukraine created a designed collapse by targeting the peninsula's grid, its transformer stations, at every voltage level, one by one. The goal is not a single night's blackout. It's cumulative, permanent damage that grows steadily harder to repair. When Moscow repairs one transformer, Ukraine strikes the next, and the grid, exactly as planned, falls apart piece by piece. This is the clearest face of the strategy called logistics denial. Wearing down the enemy not with a bomb, but by collapsing the systems that keep it standing. The human dimension of this picture grows heavier too. According to one local resident, in some areas dishes are washed with rainwater, generators are sold directly out of the backs of trucks, and people have been reduced to begging for canned food by mail. A peninsula once presented as Russia's prize, where millions of tourists once flocked, is now on the brink of a basic humanitarian crisis. And this picture is the barest proof of how unsustainable the occupation is. Seizing a piece of land is one thing, but making it livable is another thing entirely. The third, and perhaps most strategic arm of the siege, is unfolding at sea. And this is an operation without precedent in the history of modern warfare. In early July, Ukraine launched a naval campaign it named Molochka, a systematic attack carried out with naval and aerial drones on Russia's shadow fleet in the Sea of Azov and the Black Sea, that is, the tankers used to evade sanctions. According to figures given by the commander of Ukraine's unmanned systems forces, in the campaign's first 3 weeks, more than 201 vessels were struck, 129 of them in the Azov, 72 in the Black Sea. This meant the effective sealing of an entire sea without any warship, using only mass-produced drones. The genius of this campaign is in its targeting. As the commander explained, filling one large export tanker requires 12 to 15 small supply vessels, so burning the small ships paralyzes the whole chain. Ukrainian drones strike these ships without sinking them, turning them into ghosts drifting across the sea, no longer able to carry cargo. The cost asymmetry of the campaign is striking too. Each drone costs a small fraction of the tanker it destroys. The economic weight of this blow reaches far beyond Crimea. Russia was forced to reroute its wheat shipments to ports other than the Azov, and even at Novorossiysk, one of the largest oil ports in the Black Sea, loading operations were disrupted by the operation. Oil exports are the largest source of cash for Russia's war economy, and Ukraine spent all of 2026 attacking exactly this revenue, striking both the refineries and the tankers. The naval blockade is the sharpest edge of this economic siege. Every barrel Russia can't move freely raises the price of its war a little more. And this naval blockade pushed Russia into a strategic resource vicious cycle. To protect its shadow fleet and its tankers, Russia was forced to pull hundreds of air defense personnel and drone crews from the front line and shift them to the sea. So Ukraine's handful of naval drones was weakening both Russia's oil revenue and its defensive strength at the front at once. This operation has a historical significance too. According to military analysts, this is the first documented case in the history of modern warfare in which a country effectively sealed off an entire sea using only mass-produced drones without any surface warship. The closest historical precedent was the tanker war in the Persian Gulf in the 80s, but that campaign used mines, shore-launched missiles and aircraft, not entirely unmanned, cheap systems. What Ukraine has achieved here is fundamentally changing the economics of war. The impact of this pressure crossed Russia's borders too. The halt of cargo traffic in the Kerch Strait and the Azov struck not just Russian wheat, but the international players using that route. So much so that the disruption of some loading operations in the region came to threaten even neighboring countries' economic interests. These seas, once a safe backyard for Russia, have now turned into a risk zone that traders and shippers try to steer clear of. So the last of the three supply arteries to Crimea, land, rail and sea, was thereby closed too. So is this whole siege a random wave of attacks? No. Behind it is a strategy designed years ago, and the architect of that strategy saw today's events long in advance. Valery Zaluzhny, the former commander-in-chief of Ukraine's armed forces, recently made a striking statement. According to him, Ukraine had planned the operation to isolate Crimea remotely as far back as 2023. Our Western partners didn't believe it at the time, he said. But today, this plan is working. So the land, energy and sea siege we see on the ground today is the product not of a moment's anger, but of a roadmap drawn 3 years ago. Zaluzhny's analysis also sheds light on the changing nature of war. According to him, rapidly advancing technology has changed the fundamental principles of war, and traditional territorial conquest no longer provides the advantage it once did. This assessment is confirmed exactly in the case of Crimea. The only major strategic goal Russia achieved throughout the war was establishing a land corridor to occupied Crimea. But as the former commander-in-chief stressed, Russian forces can no longer fully use that route, thanks to scientific and technological progress and Ukraine's counterattacks. The most striking part of this foresight is that no one believed it at first. When Ukraine put this plan on the table in 2023, its Western partners found it unrealistic. The idea that an entire peninsula could be isolated by remote strikes alone without being directly occupied ran counter to the military logic of the time. But in the time since, the leap in drone technology made this impossible plan possible. Today, the case of Crimea is like a laboratory for the future of war, living proof of how cheap, mass-produced systems, rather than expensive tanks and large armies, can paralyze an entire occupation. The working of this plan, in fact, took years. Ukraine built this siege not overnight, but step by step. First by developing drones that extended the range, then by learning to use these drones in coordinated swarms, and finally by reaching the capacity to strike 3 separate fronts, land, energy, sea, at once. This gradual strategy, turning to the energy grid when pressure on the land corridor reached a point, and to the sea when that crisis deepened, left Russia no room to breathe. Each front fed the next. As the land route closed, the sea route became critical, and when the sea route was struck, Russia had no safe option left. This strategy in fact rests on a philosophy, instead of conquering, making the occupation unsustainable. As a Ukrainian intelligence official explained, the campaign's goal is not yet a ground operation to retake Crimea, it's to make the occupation as difficult and expensive as possible for the enemy. This is why the targets are not resorts or symbolic buildings, they're bridges, rail junctions, fuel depots, and logistics centers. Ukraine, not with a sword, but like a patient surgeon, is slowly squeezing the occupation's windpipe. So why is this siege so important? Why could Crimea be a turning point for the entire war? The answer lies in the unique meaning this peninsula holds for Russia. In the striking words of a Russian commander fighting against Russia, Crimea is Putin's crown jewel, the one gain he can point to in the 25th year of his rule. This carries a historical weight. Russia lost the Crimean War in the 19th century, and in 2014, annexing Crimea without firing a single shot gave Putin the claim that he had reversed that history. Crimea is the symbol of Putin's entire narrative of power, of his promise to rebuild a great Russia. But Crimea's importance is not only symbolic, it's entirely military and strategic. The peninsula is the logistics base feeding all of Russia's southern front, the heart of the Black Sea Fleet, and the launch pad for all occupation operations in the south. This is why, in that same Russian commander's words, if Crimea is once lost, the whole front collapses. Crimea's isolation threatens not just a peninsula, but Russia's entire military presence in the south. This military value of Crimea was one of Russia's greatest cards from the start of the war. The port of Sevastopol is the main base of Russia's Black Sea Fleet, and this fleet was used both to threaten Ukraine's ports and to hold naval dominance in the Black Sea. But the peninsula's collapse in energy and logistics terms erodes the value of this military base too. A military base cut off from electricity, fuel and supplies, no matter how strong, grows steadily non-functional. And Russia, from this fortress where it once ruled the Black Sea, is now becoming unable to even protect its own ships. This creates a pressure on Putin that is psychological as much as military. Since it was annexed in 2014, Crimea has been the most powerful victory narrative of Russian state propaganda. It was presented as concrete proof of the claim that lost lands were reclaimed and Russia grew again. This is why Crimea sinking into darkness is not just a military problem, it's the cracking of the very story the regime tells its own people. When a leader's most powerful symbol weakens, the entire narrative of legitimacy built on that symbol begins to shake as well. And this is exactly where the siege's true strategic genius emerges. Ukraine isn't trying to occupy Crimea directly, it's turning it into an impossible-to-defend burden. A peninsula that once gave strength and depth to Russia's southern front is now turning into an open wound that swallows Russia's resources and grows steadily more expensive to protect. Out of fear of losing his most valuable jewel, Putin is forced to pour more resources there, but every resource he pours in weakens another part of the front. This is empire's classic dilemma. Defending the thing deemed most valuable sometimes turns into the greatest strategic trap. Now, when we bring this whole picture together, a clear conclusion emerges. Russia's occupation of Crimea is becoming steadily unsustainable. The clearest proof of this is how Russia has been forced to redirect its resources. To counter the naval blockade, the Russian army pulled an entire air defense division and elite drone crews from the front line and shifted them to the Azov and Black Sea coasts. This is exactly what Ukraine wants, to force the enemy to protect the wrong things in the wrong places. Every unit pulled from the front leaves a gap at the front, and every tanker it tries to protect raises the cost of the war a little more. The real logic beneath this picture is cost asymmetry. The drones Ukraine uses cost a tiny fraction of the tankers, transformers, and convoys they destroy. So Ukraine, with a low-cost tool, inflicts billions of dollars of economic and military damage on Russia. And this asymmetry grows against Russia over time. Moscow can neither repair the damage, nor stop the new waves of attacks, nor stop having to pay the bill for the occupation. The reflection of this asymmetry at the front is direct too. When Russia pulls elite drone crews and an entire air defense division from the front to protect its tankers at sea, the gap those units leave opens space for Ukraine at other points. So the pressure on Crimea creates a domino effect, not just in Crimea, but across the whole war. As Russia tries to protect the sea, the front, and the peninsula's infrastructure all at once, it's forced to spread its forces into an ever thinner layer. And in strategy, the side that tries to defend everywhere often can't fully defend anywhere. But here it's necessary to be honest and balanced. This whole picture doesn't mean Crimea will fall tomorrow or that the Russian occupation will suddenly end. This is not a rescue operation by ground assault, it's a patient, long-term war of attrition. Russia still has a strong military presence on the peninsula, and a significant portion of the figures from the ground are Ukrainian-sourced and hard to fully verify independently. But the direction is impossible to deny. Crimea, once considered Russia's strongest fortress, is now one of its most fragile points, and this carries a deep meaning for the course of the war. Crimea's story is, in fact, the story of how modern war has changed. Seizing a piece of land was once enough to hold it, but today, the side that can cut off the roads, the energy, and the sea leading to that land can make it undefendable without landing a single soldier. burning tankers, cities sinking into darkness, and closing straits, these are all different faces of the same silent truth. Crimea is slowly being turned into an island, and that island is steadily sinking. Of course, reading this picture as a declaration of victory is still premature. The occupation continues physically, and the consequences of this siege may play out over years. But this is exactly where Putin's tragedy lies. Crimea, which he presented as the greatest symbol of his rule, his most valuable crown jewel, is now becoming his greatest burden. A peninsula that was once proof of his strength is now the mirror of his weakness. History is full of examples of such sieges. Military history has shown time and again that taking a fortress often begins not by breaking down its walls, but by cutting the roads leading to it. A fortress left hungry, left without water, its ties to the outside world severed, is doomed to rot from within, even with the strongest walls. What Ukraine is doing in Crimea is exactly this ancient siege logic, rewritten with modern technology. Instead of attacking the walls, cutting the fortress's windpipe. And this time, that windpipe is being squeezed from 3 separate arms: land, sea, and energy lines at once. And history has taught the same lesson again and again. An empire's brightest jewel often turns into the wound that wears it down the most, that bleeds it the most. What's being learned today in Crimea's dark streets is this: empire projects are sometimes dismantled not with the roar of cannons, but transformer by transformer, convoy by convoy, ship by ship. And that peninsula, today in the very midst of this silent dismantling, is slowly turning into an island, a besieged, dark, and increasingly lonely island. So do you think this siege of Crimea is a strategic turning point that will change the course of the war? Or can Russia manage to sustain its occupation of the peninsula despite all this pressure? What Scala did in its sector, Ukraine is doing across the entire southern front with its mid-range drone campaign. And the clearest proof came from Russian sources' own mouths. They openly admitted they had lost control of the southern highway and that regular transport had become extremely difficult. Repeated drone strikes had effectively made the R280 highway, a key artery, unusable for Russian supply traffic. The curious part was that Russian officials kept insisting, all the while, that everything is under control, Ukrainian drones have lost their edge. Yet the reality was the exact opposite. The number of drone strikes had dropped, not because Russian countermeasures had grown stronger, but because Russian traffic on the roads had collapsed. The risk of being knocked out had risen so high that far fewer fuel tankers and trucks could set out. With fewer targets to hit, the strikes merely appeared to fall. The scale of this spreading threat is captured by one of hundreds of recorded strikes. On a highway toward Mariupol, an orderly Russian truck convoy is moving when a Ukrainian drone suddenly appears and strikes one of the vehicles. The point of the convoy tactic was safety, yet even organized columns are no longer untouchable on these roads, and moving together often creates a larger target. Dozens of trucks in parking lots were knocked out before they got the chance to move, and the wreckage lining the Berdyansk-Melitopol highway proved the problem had spread not to one road, but to several southern routes. To stop these strikes, Russia deployed mobile air defense groups, pickup trucks fitted with machine guns meant to escort convoys and shoot down incoming drones. But this was a lost battle. There was neither the capacity nor the resources to protect hundreds of kilometers of road at every point at once. And once Ukraine began hunting these mobile groups too, the area they could cover shrank further. The seconds they had to detect and down a small, fast drone were already too few. When the mobile groups failed, Russia switched to interceptor drones. And here the most ironic scene of the war appeared. The units tasked with protecting the logistics network could no longer be supplied, precisely because that logistics network had collapsed. When fuel and spare parts stopped reaching forward launch points, the interceptor drone units dried up. A defense system collapsed along with the very thing it was meant to protect. The truly tragic part of this vicious cycle is this. The vehicles carrying the interceptor drones, delivering batteries and fuel, needed fuel to run themselves. Once that fuel was cut, Russia's interceptor units were left without spare parts and without fuel, and gave up defending the supply roads altogether. In short, Russia could no longer feed its own shield. At last, Russian division commanders found their remedy in retreat. They moved field refueling points roughly 100 kilometers back from the front. This shielded the depots from being struck a little, but it dramatically lengthened the supply lines, inflated delivery times, and made logistics even worse. The result was that Russian troops on the southern front were left without stable supply, condemned to scale back their offensives and ration what they had. Looking at the overall picture, Ukraine's sustained drone campaign turned southern Ukraine into an increasingly hostile environment for Russian logistics. By systematically targeting trucks, fuel, and critical transport roads, it forced Moscow into reactive measures, and none of them could re-establish secure supply lines. Russia's highway defense, in the end, collapsed because it depended on the very supply network it was meant to protect. When an army has to feed the units protecting its logistics with that same logistics, the vicious cycle becomes inevitable. The strategic target of this logistical strangulation isn't individual trucks, it's an entire peninsula. The land corridor connecting Russia's occupied southern regions to Crimea, vital since the war's very start, is now slowly turning into a corridor of loss. The key route of this corridor is the line running from Mariupol to Chonhar. Ukraine's drone unit, named Signum, has brought this main artery under constant fire control. Every convoy carrying troops, ammunition, or fuel is now a potential target. A road that was once a safe backbone to Crimea has turned into an increasingly dangerous trap for Russian forces. To understand why this corridor is so critical, we look at what it is. After 2022, Russia built this land route connecting the occupied Donbass and Zaporizhia territories to Crimea as a vital backbone, so as not to depend on the Kerch Bridge alone. Every Russian element in Crimea, from the Black Sea Fleet to its air defense batteries, feeds largely off this route. When that line comes under constant fire, Moscow is left with two bad options: send convoys into the risk of being knocked out, or turn to far longer, far more fragile alternative roads. Both options mean a loss of time, fuel, and security. The meaning of choking this link is enormous. Crimea is the base of the Black Sea Fleet, the backbone of Russia's entire military presence in the south. When the supply road to it comes under threat, Moscow has to reroute its reinforcements and seek longer, more brittle alternatives, meaning it loses its strategic depth. Ukraine also struck energy infrastructure in occupied Mariupol, raising the pressure on the port city. Kyiv, by hitting targets ever deeper in Russia's rear, is straining both Moscow's air defense and its logistics at once. And this isn't a one-off raid, but a lasting control. Under Signum's continuous fire, the movement of troops, ammunition, and fuel is seriously disrupted. The lifeline that once flowed safely to Crimea is slowly becoming a noose. If Russia can't keep this link open, it faces the risk of losing not just one road, but all of its strategic depth in the south. That is why the logistics war in the south carries a far bigger wager than what shows on the map. Every kilometer of road lost can weigh as much as a lost division. This southern picture isn't the war's only front. To the north, in the Lyman direction, there's a striking movement too. Through counterattacks running for 2 months, Ukraine holds the initiative in the northern part of this sector. Most of the gains come not from large tank columns, but from infiltration attacks and drone operators. This is a picture that strengthens Ukraine's hand over Russia's in the northern sector, even though Russia too has many infiltration attempts in the same direction. According to confirmed reports, Russian forces managed at one point to push small infiltration groups right into the town, but those groups were cleared. The advance moves not with big, showy strokes, but step by step, slowly but steadily, the quiet, grinding rhythm of the modern front. But the picture has to be read without exaggeration. Ukraine can't attack from within Lyman itself. With supply in the town insufficient, it applies pressure from the north. The Russians weren't idle either, managing to pull Yampil out of the grey zone. Yet the small Russian groups infiltrating into Lyman were neutralized. The real constraint in the area is geography. The Siversky Donets River and the destroyed bridges narrow Ukraine's supply lines, and the pontoon bridges it sets up are regularly targeted by the glide bombs of Russian aviation. The strategic dimension is this: Lyman is not Moscow's top priority. Russian pressure is concentrated mainly in the Kostyantinivka and Pokrovsk directions. Though Russia plans to take Lyman and later approach Slovyansk from the north, it has given its resources to another axis. Its effort to reach Kostyantinivka, meanwhile, has cost the Russian side dearly. The price of pushing from a single direction into the most fortified terrain was astronomical losses in that sector. Ukrainian drones are working to ease this pressure too. In the Lyman direction, they knocked out a Russian Grad multiple-launch rocket system and its ammunition load, taking a key artillery piece off the board on the Donbass front, where Moscow is running infantry assaults. And these two fronts, the logistical strangulation in the south and the infiltration war in the north, aren't independent. Both share the same logic: to force Russia, at many points at once, to burn through its own resources. As Moscow shifts force to one front, another weakens, and the depleted reserves make the cost of every new move a little heavier. While Russian advances continue in some areas in the overall front balance, this logistical pressure is eroding any long-term edge. Territory may shift slowly on the map, but an army's real strength lies in its capacity to get troops and ammunition to that territory. And it's exactly that capacity melting away, day by day, in the south. On the geopolitical plane, this is a picture that puts a question mark over the sustainability of Russia's losses. Buying territory slowly, while losing far faster the logistical backbone that would hold it, is not, in the long run, a survivable equation. Now let's step back and read the big picture. The common thread of all these developments is the evolution of classic attrition warfare into an asymmetric form. The drone-supported operations of special assault regiments like Scala are no longer a contest where both sides take equal losses in the trenches. They are an equation where one side targets the other's nervous system, its supply, its communications, its fire support. The most striking part of this equation is the cost asymmetry. An FPV drone worth a few $100s can neutralize a tank, an artillery system, or a full fuel tanker worth millions. This turns the economics of war upside down. The attacker loses cheap, the defender loses expensive. And when these drones strike not just the equipment, but the system feeding it, a single successful hit can indirectly take dozens of frontline troops out of the fight. That is why Ukraine, with limited manpower, can corner a far larger army in selected sectors. The terrifying part of this model is that it creates a self-feeding loop. When Russian reinforcements are neutralized before they even reach the front, Moscow's force rotation capacity is strained. It has to use ever longer, ever more fragile lines to send in replacements. The logistical collapse in the south, by threatening Crimea's supply security, causes a loss of strategic depth. And that loss makes the next defensive line even less defensible. This fragility spreads from the top down. Russia has to keep a rotation turning to replace worn-out units, but when reinforcements are melted away before reaching the front, the gears of that rotation seize up. Every unit lost leaves a gap that grows harder to fill, and when an army falls below the pace of its own renewal, it loses ground in the long run, no matter what the map shows. This summer, what changed the nature of the war is exactly this. What's decisive is not the front line itself, but the resilience of the system feeding it. The real question in the long run is how long Russia's manpower and equipment reserves will hold under this pressure. The danger of the Scala model is that it isn't confined to a single sector. A recipe for collapsing an army through its logistics becomes transferable to other fronts, as it's proven. And each time this model repeats, Moscow's capacity both to generate force and to deliver that force to the front is strained a little more. The top-level reflection of this pressure is seen at the command level. Ukraine's mid- and long-range strike capacity can reach Russia's rear even at depths once considered safe. As a result, Russia has come to lose even its general-level commanders. For an army's highest command ring to be this exposed is no ordinary attrition. It's the clearest sign of the fragility of the command and control system. Russia's answer to this has often been not tactics, but propaganda. While trying to build new lines with exhausted forces on the ground, its generals' reports still say the situation is under control. A small infiltration group planting a flag in a village and posing for the camera is presented as a huge victory. Yet the sole purpose of most of these moves is to manufacture imagery, to manage perception, not the reality on the ground. Russian sources' own admissions, contrary to those very propaganda claims, give away the situation on the field. This military picture is taking shape on a political ground far beyond the front. In the West, as the future of the weapons to be supplied to Ukraine is debated, Patriot air defense missiles and Tomahawk cruise missiles sit at the center of the agenda. Washington's cautious stance on licensing and direct delivery, especially its reserved approach to requests for production licenses and direct missile transfers, is forcing Ukraine to accelerate its own solutions. This debate has a concrete face. To be able to stop Russian ballistic missiles, Kiev requested Patriot missiles directly and a production license. But these requests, at least for now, were met cautiously in Washington. Tomahawk cruise missiles sit in a similar uncertainty. Yet Ukraine's need is urgent. While domestic production may take years, it needs the tools to stop Russian ballistics today. This gap is pushing Kiev ever more toward its own solutions and toward striking Russian launchers at the source. And what's really decisive here is the speed at which Ukraine fills this gap with its own industry. As the West's supply fluctuates, domestic drone production and tactical innovation are becoming the real foundation of Kiev's resilience. What keeps it standing is not an imported capacity, but one produced in the field and constantly evolving. And behind this military resolve lies a tense domestic politics. In Ukraine, reform debates and protests run parallel to the successes at the front. Changes at the defense ministry can even affect negotiations over access to critical technologies like Starlink. The dismissal of key figures led to the severing of prior contacts with critical technology firms and made the search for alternative paths for ballistic missile defense necessary. It's clear why this domestic turbulence affects the equation at the front. Access to critical technologies, stability in the command echelon, and relations with allies all feed directly into capacity on the field. The tension between reform and transparency demands on one hand and the war's urgent needs on the other is one of the most delicate balances before Kyiv. Still, at least at this stage, the concrete gains at the front appear to keep this tension from paralyzing the military machine. How delicate this balance is shown by a concrete example. Access to the satellite links and communications infrastructure, critical for field drone operations, is not only a technical but also a diplomatic matter. Securing that access is an invisible but decisive part of sustaining drone dominance at the front. And once such a link is put at risk, even the most successful operation on the ground can be thrown off. Here, it's important to distinguish the parties' claims. The weapons debates in the West, the scale of the protests in Ukraine, and the course of domestic politics are reported differently by different sources. Rather than reaching a firm verdict, it's healthier to focus on how these developments affect the equation at the front. In the end, the Dnipropetrovsk breakthrough, the logistical blockade in the south, and the counter-pressure at Liman aren't the sum of individual victories. They're the sign that Ukraine is running a multi-vector attrition strategy, one focused less on taking territory than on collapsing the enemy's supply system. The real importance of the Scala model lies not in the 75 square kilometers it took, but in its being repeatable. Striking an army at its logistics before its land and collapsing it under its own weight is now a proven recipe that can be carried to other fronts. Russian sources' own admissions, contrary to the propaganda narrative, reflect the reality on the ground, and the future of the war is being tied, ever more clearly, to who will hold logistical superiority and drone dominance rather than territory. This is the real fracture quietly changing the character of the war in the summer of 2026, and the thing that will determine how strong the hand of whoever holds that superiority will be tomorrow, when they too sit down at the table. So do you think Ukraine's strangle the logistics strategy will truly force Russia to the table, beyond gains of territory? Or will Moscow, even with exhausted forces, keep building new lines and holding on? And which way will the West's weapons equation turn this picture?
Unfortunately, we decided to leave Crimea temporarily. Lack of electricity, together with the lack of water.
I am addressing Moscow and Putin on behalf of the people of Crimea. But in reality, we have empty gas stations, fear, inspections, queues, and complete uncertainty.
Russia's crown jewel is falling as control of Crimea is slipping away before Putin's eyes. And by all appearances, the evacuation has already begun, and not only among civilians. Every sign suggests that Russian soldiers too are preparing to abandon the peninsula. We have a leaked document that proves it, in the words of Russia's own generals in Crimea. And in a moment, we will lay it on the table in all its stark nakedness. But first, a brief look at the picture. Today, the situation for the Russians in Crimea is nothing short of a disaster. The peninsula has plunged into darkness. Chaos and panic rule the streets, Most fuel stations have pulled down their shutters, supermarket shelves are thinning out, and 2,400,000 people are waging what can only be called a struggle for daily survival.
What I'm really most interested in is, where is the humanitarian aid for Crimea? Well, not too long ago, we were collecting, let's say, humanitarian aid for Dagestan. But where's the humanitarian aid for us? Why isn't anyone bringing it to us?
Electricity, water, fuel, transport, communications, everything that keeps a life running is being severed all at once. And in the middle of this picture, Russia's 12-year project is reversing before our eyes. Since 2014, Moscow had shipped up to 800,000 settlers onto this peninsula, declaring it ours forever. Now those same settlers have packed their bags and taken the road back, 3,000 kilometers to Barnaul, to their real homelands beyond the Urals. And the soldiers have already begun to abandon Crimea. According to the leak relayed by United 24 on July 17th, a Russian order revealed that the command of the Black Sea Fleet has been compiling evacuation lists for the families of its own officers and civilian staff, and the deadline printed on the telegram had already passed, July 10th. The most striking part is that none of this caught anyone off guard, because two men had described what was coming almost address by address. On July 13th, the commander of Ukraine's unmanned systems forces, Robert Brovdy, callsign Magyar, compressed the entire strategy into a single sentence in his interview with Irish journalist Caelan Robertson.
We're not touching the Crimean bridge, in case you, haven't noticed. Let them get out over it. Let all those millions fuck off across that bridge, damn it, without stopping, straight back to their Russia, and go somewhere far beyond the Urals to live in peace.
2 days later, Zelensky built the political roof over that same strategy, declaring Ukraine's goal in one sentence anyone could understand.
Our aim is not a Russia without gasoline. It is a Ukraine without Russia.
These were not two nice turns of phrase. Zelensky was not bluffing. This was a warning with an address on it. And that warning was read in 3 different places, in 3 utterly different ways. In the command bunker in Sevastopol, as an evacuation telegram. On the Crimean street, as a wave of panic. And in the Kremlin, as the silence of a trap with no way out. We are now going to put those 3 readings on the table, one by one. But first, a small request. Independent war and technology analysis like this gets suppressed by the algorithm, and the video never reaches many of the people it could. Subscribing, liking the video, and dropping even a single word in the comments directly helps us break through that suppression. It only takes a few seconds. Now, let's begin with the first reading, the leaked telegram itself. Because the paper in question is written on the occupier's own letterhead, under the occupier's own signature, and it speaks, line by line. According to the leak obtained by Void Group and relayed by United 24, Admiral Sergei Pinchuk, commander of the Black Sea Fleet and head of the Sevastopol territorial garrison, issued a telegram under an urgent code. Evacuation lists are to be prepared for the families of fleet personnel and civilian employees, and the lists are to be submitted no later than July 10th. The order carries high priority status, to be executed immediately, ahead of standard military correspondence, and its scope? Every single unit in the Sevastopol garrison, without exception. 3 details carry the weight of this order. First, according to the records, this is the first documented evacuation order to come out of the Sevastopol command since the start of the full-scale invasion. Not a rumor, not an Atesh relay, a headed, dated, signed directive. Second, who the man issuing it is. Pinchuk was born in Sevastopol, an admiral commissioning the evacuation lists of the very city he was born in. When a commander signs such an order for his own hometown, that signature is the bitterest report anyone could write about that city's future. Third, and most important, the breadth of the scope. The telegram covers the garrison's entire skeleton, from the Air Defense Army to the ship repair yard, from the recruitment offices to the naval academies. But the entries that truly stop you are elsewhere, the Navy's hospital and sanatoriums. The Navy's own newspaper, Flag Rodiny, even the branches of the Central Naval Museum. When a newspaper and a museum are written onto an evacuation list, that list is no longer a military document. It is the inventory of a farewell. From the hospital to the museum, from the shipyard to the newspaper. This is not a unit-changing station. It is the emptying of an entire institutional ecosystem. When armies abandon a position, they move battalions. When they abandon a city, they write its museum, its hospital, and its newspaper onto a list. The Sevastopol command is doing the second. Those familiar with Russian military correspondence will underline one more detail. The high priority code, crisis protocol, not peacetime routine, processed ahead of all standard paperwork. The command is not filing this under a possibility for later. It is writing it into today's urgent agenda. Some will call it merely an exercise. Let them. The scope itself refutes the argument. For an exercise, one unit's list would suffice. Writing the newspaper's staff, the museum's branches, and the sanatorium personnel into the same telegram describes not a unit maneuver, but the wholesale withdrawal of a presence. Nor did this order fall from the sky. It is the last link in a chain that has been working for months. In April, Atesh reported panic inside fleet units, with the families of senior officers leaving in haste. In mid-June, the same network reported that plans were being drawn up to relocate the fleet's remaining command structures to Novorossiysk, with some officers selling off property without waiting for orders. And now, in July, the official written order has arrived. Rumor, report, document. 3 steps, 1 direction, the exit. Now let's see how that telegram echoed on the street. In truth, the Crimean street had read the warning with its own body long before any document, because the life the telegram describes had been at its door for months. Parts of northern Crimea have been without electricity for over 10 days. Water, gas, and mobile outages chase one another. People post evacuation appeals online, hunt for fuel and gas canisters. Looting is discussed openly. The Russian Red Cross announced Monday distributions of food, hygiene supplies, and water, and the list also includes wheelchairs, walkers, canes, and crutches. Read that aid list again. When canes and walkers are what a region needs, it tells you by itself who has been left behind. Those who could leave are long gone. And the public's question still hangs in the air. Where is the promised help? On the fuel front, the picture is even more naked. Sales of gasoline and diesel to civilians were ground down step by step. A 20-litre daily cap, then coupons, then zero, with the remaining stock reserved for the state, the security services, and the military. The surge in online searches for how to make gasoline at home is despair, spelled out in a search bar. And the street has begun to answer. Even after another one-night stabilization announcement, a fresh wave is packing its bags. Some for Barnaul 3,000 kilometers away, some for the far side of the Urals. One bitter Russian comment circulating online sums up the picture in a single line. The migration of the occupiers has begun. And another post found the metaphor for Moscow's historic prize, a suitcase without a handle, impossible to carry, forbidden to drop. The Occupation Administration issues its periodic stabilization bulletins, but the street looks not at the bulletin, at the pump, and the pump is dry. Every time the gap between official statement and lived reality widens, one more family reaches for the suitcase. And the answer to the most poisonous question on the street's mind is now known to everyone. What the state was planning for its own people was written in the telegram we have just read. While the public queued at the pumps, the command was drawing up lists. A short break. If you've made it this far, liking the video and writing your thoughts below helps this analysis reach far more people. If you're not subscribed, subscribe. Because next comes the machinery that made this order inevitable. How the noose was tightened. What forced Pinchuk to write that telegram was not a single strike. It is the combined weight of 4 interlocking campaigns. At sea, Ukraine's Operation Molochka has turned into a hunting party. 159 vessels struck in 12 days, the 116 in the Sea of Azov now joined by the Black Sea phase, and the campaign has no announced end date. A large share of the vessels hit are Shadow Fleet tankers, the ships that carry fuel to Crimea through the Kerch Strait. In the same days, fires rose at Kerch's railway hub. The fuel arteries entering the peninsula by sea and by rail are being cauterized at the same time. The choice of hunting ground is no accident. The Kerch Strait ties the Azov to the Black Sea, and both to Crimea. The Shadow Fleet carries the peninsula's fuel through that narrow channel. Ukraine concentrated first on the Azov. When the fleet flared into the Black Sea, the hunt expanded with it. Wherever the ships run, they stay inside the same net. Narrow water is a gift to the hunter. In energy, the transfer node of the Kuban-Crimea power bridge, 9 transformer substations, and a gas pumping station have been struck. The plugs connecting the peninsula to the mainland are being pulled one by one. And in the sky, the shield has been stripped bare. By Magyar's own count, an S-400 launcher, Tor M2 and Pantsir S-1 systems, and 2 Nebo-U early warning radars have been destroyed. A defense that loses its radar is not merely weakened, it is blinded, and everything a blind shield protects is a target waiting its turn.
Even the 1-month balance sheet speaks for itself. Barely a month into the lockdown, a state of emergency on the peninsula, vehicle movement cut back, units under fuel economy orders. And today, much of the armor sits parked, patrols rationed, generators on allowances. In the drone age, everything that stands still is a target waiting for its number to be called. A garrison out of fuel first slows, then freezes, then gets marked on a map. And there is a nervous system layer to this campaign too. As early as late April, Ukraine struck the Naval Traffic Control Center in Sevastopol and the Streletsky Command Facility, the site coordinating the movements of Black Sea Fleet vessels. So while the fleet compiles lists for its families, its own nerve center for coordinating those movements has been in bandages for months. In his interview with Kaelan Robertson, Magyar laid out the objective without a single ornament. There is no fuel in Crimea, and there will not be any. The aim is to destroy every kind of logistics feeding the Russian forces on the peninsula: personnel, ammunition, equipment, weapons. And for the first time in history, an entire occupied peninsula is being pushed into effective isolation without a large-scale ground operation. Tanks are burning, there is no fuel, there is no power. In Magyar's words, there is no future there for Russia's war machine. The third reading happened in the Kremlin, and it is the quietest and the most helpless of the three. Because Moscow sees perfectly well what this strategy is. Magyar has announced it openly. We are cutting the roads in, not the roads out. We are not touching the Kerch Bridge. Let them cross that little bridge and return to their own Russia. Military literature has an old name for this choice: Sun Tzu's principle. Always leave the enemy a way out. A force that is completely cornered resists to the very end, but a majority that sees an open door walks through it on its own feet. In this equation, the Kerch Bridge is no longer a bridge. It is a pressure valve. A relief vent that drains the panic building up on the peninsula without a battle. The answers to the question of why the bridge is still standing point the same way. Analysts have long counted leaving the Russian army an escape route and preserving Putin's prestige project as a bargaining chip among the reasons. Which means what stands over that strait today is not a lifeline at all, but a one-way exit door. And the bridge's own traffic testifies that the valve is working. Long convoys in the outbound direction, near empty lanes inbound. That asymmetry between a bridge's two directions is a datum no official statement can match. People are voting, on wheels. This silence is itself a message. State television still sings, "Everything is under control." The same state's admiral is collecting evacuation lists in the same week. For years, Putin marketed Crimea as Russia's sacred soil. And having that soil's hospital and museum written onto an exit list is a footnote to the sanctity, entered in your own hand. The bargaining value dissolves too. A peninsula you cannot hold is not a card at the table, but a liability, and nobody negotiates over the rent of a house you are already moving out of. Here is where the Kremlin's dilemma ties itself into a knot. It knows about the valve, and it cannot close it. Shut the bridge with its own hands, and it traps its garrison and more than 2 million people in a cage. Keep it open, and the draining continues, its presence on the peninsula thinning by the day. It is the position of a player who sees the trap but cannot step out of it. A board where every available move loses. And Moscow's answer so far has not been to flip the board, it has been to say nothing. While the Kremlin stays silent, Kiev is doing the opposite, narrating its strategy out loud. And the rest of Zelensky's speech shows that this strangulation is not a tactic, it is a strategic objective. Zelensky notes that some say Ukraine is sending Russia back to the Middle Ages with modern technology, and that others celebrate the fuel shortages shaking Moscow, but that what matters to Ukraine is not the words, it is the results. Nor does he hide the capacity behind them. Ukraine produces 10 million drones a year, with a target of 20 million together with its partners, and it is closer than ever never to producing Patriot missiles on its own soil. And then comes the sentence: there is no longer a single coordinate on the territory of evil that we cannot reach. Notice that Zelensky does not deny the Middle Ages charge. He sets it aside. The side that apologizes explains itself. The side that is winning shows results. And the real audience may not even be Moscow, but the Western allies. A Kiev that spent years asking for help now speaks as a country that produces, strikes, and sits at the table with its own capacity. A 20 million drone target is not a budget line, it is a bargaining position. Seen through this frame, the picture in Crimea stops being a string of successful strikes and becomes the operation of a system, a production base racing toward 20 million drones, a will that says no coordinate is out of reach, and a peninsula whose door has been deliberately left open. The results are indeed speaking: 159 ships in 12 days, a crown jewel in darkness, and an admiral who started the list-making with his own hand. Look at who this evacuation is carrying away, and you see that what is collapsing is not merely a defense, it is a 12-year project. There is a legal ledger here too. Transferring your civilian population onto occupied territory is explicitly prohibited by the 4th Geneva Convention, and the removal of close to 100,000 Ukrainians is the other page of the same ledger. What flows backward today is not just a population, it is the record of a 12-year violation. The engineering's instruments were finely tuned: preferential mortgages and posting incentives for the settlers, pressure, confiscation, and forced passports for the locals. The goal was to alter the fabric of the population beyond the point of return, an occupation carried out not by pouring concrete, but by handing out title deeds. Ukrainian officials and human rights groups put the number of Russians moved in over this period at between 500,000 and 850,000. Moscow's own official figure is far lower and fiercely disputed. The aim was clear: to make a peninsula of 2,400,000 people irreversibly, permanently Russian. Now that engineering is running in reverse, the transplanted population is flowing back where it came from, officers' families are on the lists, institutions are in suitcases, and the peninsula's property listings keep a silent record of prices being slashed in haste. Nor should the burden this reverse flow carries into Russia itself be underestimated. Hundreds of thousands sent off with promises of paradise are returning with stories of darkness, queues, and uncertainty, and every returning family brings the one thing propaganda finds hardest to silence: first-hand testimony. Television can keep saying, "Crimea is ours." What a returned neighbor recounts in a kitchen in Barnaul will outlast that sentence. The settler project is not merely collapsing, it is turning into an army of witnesses against itself. And history stands in the corner of this scene like a witness who has seen it before. In 1920, in the final act of the Civil War, the Black Sea Fleet itself left Crimea with 126 ships carrying 150,000 people to Constantinople. This fleet learned once in its history how to leave this peninsula. A century later, the same fleet is preparing an exit again, but this time its ships are long gone. What remains for those left behind is a line of convoys stretching across a bridge. The picture is striking, which is exactly why, as always, we hit the brakes and separate what we know from what we assume. The source of the leak is Void Group, a network close to the Ukrainian side. The platform that mainstreamed it, United 24, is affiliated with the Ukrainian state. Russia has neither confirmed nor denied the order. Nor can Atesh's April and June reports be independently verified. The Kiev Independent says so plainly. We say the same. The links of the chain hold together, and the document's density of detail, that institutional list, would be hard to fabricate. But the final proof will be movement on the ground itself. Mind the calendar too. The telegram's deadline was July 10th, and the leak surfaced a week later. What happened in the days between, whether the lists were submitted, and if so, what was done with them, we do not know. The document proves the order was given. It does not prove it was carried out. One more nuance deserves underlining. Compiling lists does not mean the evacuation has begun. Armies plan for contingencies. This order could be preparation for a worst-case scenario, or the first step of an actual withdrawal. Only, when a command starts writing its hospital and its museum onto a list for the worst case, the probability it assigns to that case is no longer small. And let us keep proportion. None of this means Crimea falls tomorrow. Most of the population is in place, the bridge is standing, and no landing is on the table. We also know the cornered Kremlin's first reflex: more missiles and drones at Ukrainian cities. Every tightening of the noose carries a heightened risk of retaliation against civilians. The population figures are estimate ranges. A true count waits for the occupation's end. From here, 3 roads diverge, and the coming weeks will show which one is taken. The first possibility is that the order stays in reserve. The lists wait in a drawer, Moscow manages the situation a while longer, and the crisis freezes into a new equilibrium toward winter.
The second is a quiet, phased evacuation. First, the families and the civilian institutions cross the bridge. Then the headquarters elements slide to Novorossiysk. No official statement is ever made, but the Russian presence on the peninsula thins month by month. The picture Atesh has been sketching for months points exactly this way. The third is the most dramatic. The Kremlin one day being forced to announce all of this officially, under the name of a planned redeployment, which would be the end of the 12-year, ours forever narrative, pronounced by their own mouths. And above all these scenarios hangs a calendar. Winter is coming not only to Siberia, but to the Black Sea. In storm season, the ferries falter. Ice slows the bridge. The dark hours stretch. If an evacuation is to happen, its window is the autumn, which makes the calendar on the commander's desk in Sevastopol far more merciless than the political calendar in Moscow. The longer the Kremlin delays the decision, the harder the decision itself becomes. Whichever unfolds, the places to keep a finger on the pulse are clear. The direction of traffic on the Kerch Bridge, rental listings suddenly stirring in Novorossiysk, fresh documents leaking out of Sevastopol, and whether an official announcement ever comes. The moment any one of these moves, we will know the telegram did not stay on paper. This telegram has one more addressee, one nobody planned for, the Russian soldier in a Donbass trench. While the command of the sacred peninsula he is told he is fighting for writes its own families onto lists, he is told to hold his position. Morale drains through news like this before ammunition depots ever do. If the harbor behind you is planning for itself and not for you, every day in the trench becomes a question mark. Now bring the three readings together. The command bunker read the warning as a telegram, lists, deadlines, an evacuation inventory running from its hospital to its museum. The street read it as panic. It packed its bags, joined the queue, set out on a 3,000-kilometer road. And the Kremlin read it as silence, aware of the valve, aware of the trap, holding a single bridge that is a catastrophe to close and a slow bleed to keep open. 3 different languages, 3 different reflexes, and all 3 form the same sentence. This place can no longer be held. The moment an occupation ends is not the moment a flag comes down. It is the moment the occupier's own institutions, own families, own people are written onto exit lists. That moment was entered into the record in Sevastopol, in a telegram dated July 10th, filed by an admiral's own hand. The deadline in Pinchuk's telegram was July 10th, which means, if the calendar held, those lists have long been sitting on the command's desk. And now the whole world is watching to see when the names on those lists will cross that little bridge. Because Magyar described the door a long time ago, we are not touching it, so they can pass through and go. Putin's crown jewel is not falling in battle, it is emptying out, by list, by queue, and by a one-way bridge. So what do you think? Is this leaked order a contingency plan, or the first official step of the Great Evacuation? Share your thoughts in the comments. To stay informed about Oracle Eye's exclusive war and technology analysis, please subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. Thank you for choosing us.